Now you might think, hang on, didn't you do Altered Beast before? And yeah, I did, quite a while ago. I would be happy with that, but well, for some reason a lot of my older vids are unlistenable because YouTube screwed their audio up. It's for this reason that I'd actually like to, and will, redo a bunch of them because, well, that just can't stand. And I don't know, something as important as Altered Beast perhaps deserves a bit more than a 5-minute video filled with corny jokes. It needs more. So don't worry, what you're going to get today is the full Altered Beast experience. We're certainly not going to be just sticking with the Mega Drive, that's for sure. Nor are we going to be sticking with just the original game. But obviously that's a good starting point. Now, Altered Beast's origin story isn't super special. Just another arcade game made by Team Shinobi, also known as Sega AM1, and headed up by Makoto Uchida. If you're not too familiar, then you should know that AM1 were one of Sega's premier arcade teams alongside the arguably more famous AM2 division, responsible for many arcade classics of their own, including, as you might have guessed, the original Shinobi. In this generation, they'd also make other classics like Golden Axe, Alien Syndrome, Thunderblade, and one of their very first titles, 1986's Phantasy Zone. The team is still at the head of Sega's arcade concerns today, and Uchida has remained as the division's boss since its formation. In an interview with the French website Joypad, Uchida indicated that Altered Beast was originally designed to be more complex than it eventually ended up being. Each enemy would have their own strengths and weaknesses, and the player would have to figure out what worked in order to win. Presumably a few more moves would have been available to the player. However, the concept was cut before it could be implemented into the game, which apparently did away with half of the game's animations. Ultimately though, Uchida preferred Altered Beast as it eventually came out, as a more streamlined and fun experience. The Altered Beast that we all know is simply a side-scrolling beat-em-up, with one little twist. You walk right and you kill baddies, usually with one or, at the most, 2 hits. A popular style of arcade game, seen in contemporaries like Data East's Bad Dudes and Taito's The Ninja Warriors, but traceable all the way back to IREM's Kung Fu Master. Simple, coin-eating fun, and while there's no great shakes in the gameplay, it's easy to get a kick out of it. Altered Beast differs from the previous games firstly through presentation. It is undeniably a lot better looking than most games of this type were, and filled with the sort of graphics and visual effects that Sega were known for in the arcades. Everything is relentlessly smooth and there's a whole lot of scaling, all that good stuff. And of course there's the transformation. Every time our hero kicks the heads off a white Cerberus, he can get an orb which boosts his muscles. 3 of those and he transforms into a beast, capable of attacks that lay waste to all normal enemies. It is essential to be in the beast form in order to face the end of level boss. If you fail to transform by the 3rd time you meet him, the level will loop back to the beginning. Honestly though, even though the game is quite frustrating and difficult, you kinda have to purposefully work at not transforming in order to do that. Generally you'll be transformed by the 2nd time you meet Neff, and if you play regularly you could easily be transformed by the 1st time. The plot is, well, not much. The aforementioned Neff is an evildoer from the ancient Greek underworld, and he has captured Zeus's daughter Athena. Zeus resurrects an unnamed centurion, promising him freedom if he rescues Athena, who Neff seemingly wants to change into a bird. Personally, I think he'd be better off just getting a pet already. Cue 5 stages of combat in the land of the Odyssey, battling various monsters before defeating Neff in the very pits of Hades. In true Sega style, the end credits reveal that the whole thing was actually a film, and everybody has a beer at the wrap party. The game itself is also, in all honesty, not much, especially not these days. But it was quite impressive back then, and good to see a lot of Sega's parlour tricks transferred into a genre that wasn't racing or a space shooter. The size of the bosses, turning enemies into stone, the kick-ass beast attacks and the transformations themselves, along with some really good music, mean that there is a lot of good stuff to appreciate in places. However, it does get a little monotonous. It does move quite slowly for a side-scrolling beat-em-up, and it does tend to feature a bit too much waiting around at points, waiting for a Cerberus to get into position, waiting to attack zombies, hell, just waiting for the level to catch up with you. There's a big auto-scroller element to Altered Beast that in the end doesn't really work, and if you don't get through a level quickly, they can get old pretty sharpish. The problem with that, however, is that obviously the game is at its best when you're playing as the beasts, and it's not super satisfying if you're not spending all that much time as the beasts. When you're just playing as the human, it's just a rather annoying side-scroller where you have shit attacks. Now those beasts are worth going through a little, as they do certainly change things up from the regular punch-kick formula. The first stage is a werewolf, who can use a fireball and dash across the screen, which is most satisfying although enjoyably risky against the first stage's boss. The second stage is a rare dragon, which is quite cool as he can fly. The second stage is probably my favourite as a whole, with lots of fun enemies, a moody background, and that boss with all the eyes. Mind you, if you know where to go, then the were dragon can electrocute the second level boss in literally seconds. Now the third stage has my obvious favourite beast, the were bear, affectionately known to me as Kung Fu Bear. He can turn enemies into stone and do a cannonball roll, and he just looks great. He reminds me more of a Victorian era boxer these days, mind you. The fourth stage is kind of lousy for me. The were tiger has a fireball and can do a vertical dash, but it's the least impressive stage with by far the worst boss, and honestly the least useful of the beasts. The fifth stage is disappointing too. A good background and lots of tough enemies, but the beast itself is a golden werewolf palette swap, and Neff himself can be easily cheesed with flying dash attacks. They're great designs, one and all, although it is a shame that occasionally they're not used to their best. The actual transformations themselves, though, will never stop being awesome. I do still find a lot to enjoy about Altered Beast in spite of its simplicity and its many flaws, and it's still a game that I'll happily fire up every now and again. I mean, it's so short after all, no more than 20 minutes long, and filled with nostalgia, famous moments, and things that you could recognise from other Sega games, like the cockatrices in Stage 2 that later appeared as rideable beasts called Chicken Legs in Golden Axe. The music, as in most Sega titles of the era, is stunning. There's nothing like the kick into powered up after the transformation, and the rest of the soundtrack is suitably doomy. While the gameplay certainly has its bad spots, the game does manage to make up for it with sheer spectacle at times. In the end, it's not the best Sega arcade game, and not helped by immediately preceding the much better and more impressive Golden Axe, but it certainly isn't bad. And, being a side-scroller, it was always going to be a good candidate for a home release. There are lots of conversions of this game, and we'll get to them, but obviously the first and most important one is the Mega Drive version, picked as the key title that would impress people and demonstrate the console's arcade capabilities. It had been a long time since we'd seen a machine that was capable of accurate conversions of an arcade game. You'd have to go back to the NES's early days for something like that. Since then, most arcade ports to the home were usually heavily compromised or just different games entirely. It was hoped that Altered Beast would sell the Mega Drive in the same way that Donkey Kong sold the Famicom. And so what you get is a pretty accurate conversion of the original. Almost too accurate, in fact. Very little has changed here, despite the graphics naturally taking a slight hit. The arcade scalar antics are largely gone, and obviously there's not as much colour, but the Mega Drive version does have a lot of parallax scrolling going on, which the arcade game didn't have. It's certainly 16-bit quality, and all the enemies are present and correct, as are all the levels, all the voice samples, all the cutscenes and all the transformations. The important parts that sold the game originally have not been touched. There are slight tweaks to enemy positioning and balancing that make the game easier than the arcade version, but little more than that. The only other big change I can think of is that if you somehow end up in human form by the third time you meet Neff, then you'll actually have to fight the boss as a human. The trouble with this is that while it is a very good conversion, in the end it's still the same not all that great arcade game, only without the added aura and presence that an arcade machine provides. Altered Beast really struggles to make an impression in the home. However, one other thing should be noted about this port: the immediacy of it. Altered Beast was released to the arcades in August of 1988. It was released in Japan for the Mega Drive in November of the same year. Yep, just 3 months. It was rare, if not unheard of, for an arcade game to be found in the home that quick, especially not an arcade game that would have been considered as current as Altered Beast was. It's quite likely that the whole thing was by design. Altered Beast was always destined to be a Mega Drive game, but would be hyped with an arcade release first, thus hyping the Mega Drive even more. It makes sense, seeing as Sega were looking for anything that could possibly give them a foothold in the Japanese console market, although alas this didn't work. It also gives us an answer as to why the Mega Drive port is virtually identical to the arcade in every way. With such a short timescale, it's not like there'd have been much time to actually do anything except a straight conversion. Uchida himself had only a slight role in the conversion, although apparently it was a nightmare, which suggests that the whole thing was yet another massive trademark video game death crunch. The conversion itself was coordinated by the mysterious No Nukes, whose real name is unknown, but Reiko Kodama of Phantasy Star fame worked on the project as a designer. It's technically impressive, but yeah, it does all come back to the original game itself being average. In retrospect, Altered Beast on the Mega Drive could have certainly benefited from a bit more time in development, perhaps allowing for some extra bits, or even a reintroduction of these strengths and weaknesses mechanic. It could have been a better console game. The changes in balance do make it a bit more fun to play than the arcade game, however, and being able to continue with A and Start makes it even less annoying. Generally, if I'm going to play Altered Beast, I'll play this instead of the arcade version. It's certainly fun enough, but it's not exactly a game that inspires repeated plays in the same way that, say, a Donkey Kong would. Perhaps Sega realised this and made sure that most of their later arcade conversions were accurate but also notably different and absolutely worth playing on the system. Golden Axe is a good example of Sega unquestionably getting it right, adding more stuff but still retaining the arcade's brevity. Still, I dig Altered Beast a lot, in spite of all of its faults. A lot of people really dislike it, but for me, geez, it wouldn't even belong in a top 100 of the Mega Drive's worst games, let alone 20. It also did a respectable enough job as the system's pack-in title. It's not exactly something you'd be willing to pay for separately, but it does okay as a basic introduction to the Mega Drive and what it can do. At least it did before Sonic came along. Anyway, as mentioned, there are a lot of conversions of Altered Beast that are a bit less important than the Mega Drive one. Here's some of the highlights. A few people may well know the Master System version, which is basically an even more stripped down version of the MD version. Nice to see it on here, but that's about it. The game just plays so slowly, almost to the point of it being unplayable. It's really not a good version of the game, to say the least. Cruelly, this was also the one I had growing up instead of the Mega Drive version. Ugh, what pain. The Famicom version is a weird one. Produced by Asmic, it's obviously worth wondering how on earth Altered Beast even ended up on the Famicom, being a Sega title and all. Unlike some of the Sega games that ended up on the Famicom and even the NES, like Fantasy Zone and Shinobi, which arrived courtesy of Tengen and were unlicensed, this title was officially licensed by both Sega and Nintendo. So yeah, who knows what the motivation was here. The NES Altered Beast suffers from terrible graphics, but it moves a lot smoother than the Master System game. It's also the only conversion of Altered Beast that isn't a straight port, featuring a couple of new levels with new beasts in order to make up for stuff that had to be left out. It's not great or even good, and it's incredibly difficult, but I honestly prefer it to the straight and better looking but awful Master System version. But what about the other console of the time? Well, yeah, the PC Engine got some Altered Beast, although only in Japan. And alas, it's a bit disappointing. It looks and moves fine, but the controls are just broken, everything's really slow, there's a huge delay on the jump, and it just feels nasty as hell. There's a CD version too, which even comes with a story cutscene, as well as all the speech samples that aren't on the Who card. But the gameplay is virtually identical, there's no Red Book audio, and it's only one player. Sadly, Altered Beast stinks on the PC engine. It's better than the Master System version, but that's about it. The computers got their fair share of Altered Beast too, and I couldn't not cover them. The Spectrum version, published by Activision, is actually interesting. For the specky, it looks amazing. You get the full arcade attract mode and everything. There's even a proper ending and the arcade sense of scale to boot. A lot of colours and, honestly, an acceptable amount of colour clash. A lot of enemies and other things removed, and every stage now suddenly takes place at night, but that's not a surprise. There's also cracking AY versions of the game's songs that play throughout, and even in 128K, it wasn't always common for a Spectrum game to have in-game music, let alone more than one track. However, the upshot of all this is that the game moves very slowly indeed, there's no invincibility frames, meaning that you lose lives in a second, and the controls are awful, requiring you to press back and fire to punch, and forward and fire to kick instead of, just fire. Still, it's surprising just how much the developers managed to include on the humble specky. Awesome to look at, considerably less so to actually play. The Spectrum's surprising showing gives you hope for the C64 version, but alas it doesn't really live up to it. The controls are better, this game actually has the sense to not have you press a direction to punch, which is good, and it certainly moves a bit smoother, but it all does look a bit naff. And there's no music, which is just a shocker. It has music in the intro, but nothing in game, and I can't honestly think why. Surely the C64 could handle it if the Spectrum could. It's hard to overstate just how much not having any music completely takes away from everything. This is a game that really does rely on its presentation, and so it does spoil what could have been, despite rather lousy graphics, an OK computer version. It is certainly a fuck of a lot better to play than the specky one though. So of course, if you want a decent computer version of Altered Beast, the Amiga is the best you're gonna get. It's got OK enough controls, it's got good music, and a lot less is taken out of this version than either the specky or the C64. Some things about it are annoying, it can be a bit tricky sometimes to figure out how to do both beast attacks, but generally it plays just fine. Of course it's not well liked, because this is what is known in the Amiga world as an Atari ST port, meaning just that and usually scorned by Amiga fans for being an Atari ST port, because after all the Atari ST is obviously inferior. It should also be noted, for completeness, that there's an Amstrad version that has a bit more colour, but basically plays exactly like the Spectrum version in all respects, and an MSX version that's an exact port of the Spectrum version. So now you know. And with that, well, Altered Beast basically went into hibernation. It had served its purpose and no one was exactly clamouring for a sequel. Arcade tastes changed, abandoning these side-scrolling games in favour of proper beat-em-ups and fighters, and well, it's not like Altered Beast was ever amongst Sega's most favoured titles in any case. It served a purpose as the packing title for the Mega Drive for a couple of years, but was then immediately replaced by Sonic on its arrival in 1991. By the mid to late 90s, the game was virtually a half-remembered obscurity, and there weren't exactly any calls for it to be revived. Only Matthew Sweet, clearly the game's biggest fan, flew the flag for it. However, it did return. Sort of. The now deceased THQ got the rights to make games for some old Sega IPs in the early 2000s, and one of the games that they'd publish was Altered Beast Guardian of the Realms for the Game Boy Advance, developed by the also now deceased 3D6 Games and released in 2002. So yeah, I'm sure it's really good. Now the thing with a lot of these updated games is that they're usually changed drastically and bashed into nothingness by people who don't know a whole lot about the original game. Well, don't worry, 3D6 clearly loved Altered Beast, that's for sure. Unfortunately, they loved it so much that the game is basically way more Altered Beast than you can possibly take. It's certainly faithful gameplay wise, that's for sure. The only real addition is other power-ups, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. There's all the moves, all the signature speech samples are recreated, and it's all ancient Greek mythos, only now the undead soldier has to take back control of various worlds. The trouble is it's just so long. Each stage in this game seems to be as long as hell, perhaps more than half of the original game. And there's 15 stages. This is at least a 2-hour game, which is way too friggin' long. One of the better things about Altered Beast was that it was, crucially, short. This isn't. And when all you're doing is just punching and kicking on a scrolling stage, it gets tedious before you reach the end of the first level, honestly. Like, this would probably be too much even for Matthew Sweet. And I'm really not a fan of how this pre-rendered and digitised stuff looks on the GBA at all. And with no memorable music to speak of either, there's hardly any of the original's charm. It's certainly not a terrible game, it is honestly better than I expected, but it's a very mediocre one. Well, except for this. The end of level 2 boss. Which sure is something. So, I can absolutely categorically say that Altered Beast Guardian of the Realms for the Game Boy Advance is the best game ever made where you fight a gigantic deformed penis. Probably. Anyway, 10 out of 10. Go buy it. And lastly, of course, there is the actual big attempt at a full Altered Beast revival. Project Altered Beast for the PS2 in 2005, which brings the beast into a 3D world. It wasn't worked on by just anybody either. The project was headed up by Makoto Uchida, with Reiko Kodama also involved. Long-time and highly successful Sega folks. It's very easy to assume that 3D remakes like this are always worked on by Western studios or whatever, usually of low birth. But no. Project Altered Beast had the original creators of the game leading it. Which makes you wonder just how they managed to screw it up so badly. Lack of belief? The project becoming a mess during the great Sega restructuring of 2004? Who knows, but Project Altered Beast is an absolute dog of a game. Project Altered Beast has you play as Luke Cutler, a human-come experiment who's part of some sort of genome project or whatever. The chopper carrying you crashes into a mysterious land, and you have to fight various monsters. Fighting them in human form is fairly useless, but Cutler can transform into various beasts at will, including most of your Altered Beast favourites, although I only ever got as far as the werewolf. When you transform, you get a neat video. Well, neat for the first 3 times anyway. When you're the beast, you constantly have to keep killing. There's a green bar that forever needs to be refilled, and if it's running on empty then you start to lose life. Which means you'll be seeing those videos a lot as you switch constantly. It is an okay concept, and it would have worked if the game was any good technically. But holy hell is it not. The camera is one of the worst I've ever experienced in a 3D game, almost always attracted to places where you can't see a bloody thing. There's no lock-on, which means that the beat-em-up portion of this game is basically hammer square aimlessly in all directions and hopefully hit something. It's even more mindless than the original, completely out of step with the times. I mean, there's the likes of God of War and Ninja Gaiden kicking about for heaven's sake. Why even bother with this? Anyway, here's a good part. It's called Jump at Birds for 5 minutes. And no, I'm not joking. It's so good that it's repeated again in the next fucking room. Add on everything just being so dark and grey and boring with loads of blood and all the generic vintage 2005 shit you could eat, and you really do have a piss poor game. With boring levels, overlong and lousy boss fights, and miserable controls. It's so frustrating. With a bit of technical nous, it could have been really good. It is a decent concept, but it's ruined by terrible execution. Now some say that Project Altered Beast may actually have formed the basis for the much hated Werehog stages in Sonic Unleashed. I've never bothered to play that game, but although they do look similar, they honestly look a lot better than this woeful game. Anyway, if you desperately want this game in English, it's gonna have to be PAL. The game was released in Europe and Japan, but after terrible receptions in both regions, the game never saw the light of day in the US. It's games like this that make me glad IPs like my beloved Streets of Rage managed to stay dead. Let's not forget, this wasn't made by some low-rent bunch of Americans or whatever. This was made by Sega. In fact, it was made by the exact same folks who created the original Altered Beast. Okay, not the biggest recommendation, but still. I've often talked about the fall of what was once the most glorious games company of them all, their Simpsons-esque decline into what I would call zombie Sega. If you want a game to sum up the downfall that isn't bloody Sonic 2006 again, then look no further than this one. And with that, Altered Beast once again went into a slumber. This time pretty much for good, aside from another later handheld port for the 3DS as part of Sega's 3D Classics range. There are a couple of other funny things to cover though. What about this? It's Altered Benjamin, a Flash game from the late 2000s. But not just any Flash game, a Flash game based on Altered Beast that's officially endorsed by the cruddy metal band Breakin' Benjamin. How cool is that? Altered Beast's musical legacy is so diverse that Ken Burns himself could do a documentary on it. What more do you need to say other than Matthew Sweet and Breakin' Benjamin? In all seriousness, it may not have been the most popular title, but some of Altered Beast has entered the popular consciousness. The meme Beast Mode is undoubtedly derived from Altered Beast. The various speech samples,
Rise from your grave, power up,
Welcome to your doom.
never give up.
are all pretty well known. Even if there's not a great deal of good about Altered Beast, there's certainly a lot that's memorable and a lot of notoriety. In pure corny mode 3.5 years ago while listening to way too much specials, I said that Altered Beast was the dawning of a new era, which obviously it wasn't. It was at best a gatekeeper. The first game that a lot of people played on the Mega Drive, one that would hopefully lead people towards other, better games. Never forget kids, the first one's free. Altered Beast is at its best in a pub, not playing but sitting down, having booze and reminiscing, just like all the characters in the ending. A drunken playthrough afterwards might be a little underwhelming, but hey, no matter. Just as the morning after welcomes you to your doom, Altered Beast will always be somewhat well known, a part of gaming consciousness forever. And that is quite the overachievement. Bye for now. I suppose that this game could have just gone into the games I want to talk about video, just considered on how unique it is. But then it is one of my absolute favourite Mega Drive games, so nah, it deserves a video all on its own. The game in question is Aerobiz Supersonic by Koei, part of their Executive series. It's a game where you get to manage your very own airline, take over the world through business ventures, the opening of endless routes and hubs, and meetings. There's simply no other game like it in the 16-bit era, and yeah, you can play this on the SNES too, so it's not exactly a Sega exclusive. But there's something else here too. This game is part of some of my best times with the Mega Drive, the times that came basically right at the end. Even though the game never came out in the UK, this isn't just something I picked up on an emulator. I first played it on a Mega Drive, legit. And there was one piece of kit that made it all possible, something you can't even see now, something that all Sega fans who had it have such fond memories of, and without it, playing this game, it just wouldn't have happened. And so this isn't just a video about Aerobiz Supersonic, it's also a video about the Sega channel. And I've been wanting to do something on that ever since I started making these videos back in 2012. So, now's the time. So what do we actually know about the Sega channel? Going by the dumps of prototype cartridges that exist, one of which you'll be mostly seeing here, we know that development started on it in about 1993 and it first launched in America in late 1994, where it ended up being quite successful. Over 250,000 people subscribed to it at the product's peak. How did it work? Well, it worked through cable. You paid a flat fee for the Sega channel adapter, which you plugged into the cartridge slot of the MD, and a monthly fee which gave you unlimited access to 50 games every month, although I believe it was 25 over here. Your cable provider broadcast several signals through the adapter, a continuous one for the menus, and another that cycles through the various games. When you pick a game, you wait until that game comes up on the cycle, then the adapter downloads the image of your game into the system's memory, and then 2 to 3 minutes later, you play it. The image is volatile and will be removed when the system is turned off, but you can still reset it, and I do believe that you could also save in any game that had battery backup, although you may have only been limited to one save in one game. The games in question would be sorted into various categories with various silly names. The Locker Room for sports, Think Tank for puzzle and strategy games, The Dungeon for RPGs, Winds and Wheels for racing and flying games, and so on. Of course, I'm not American, so it's not like I had the Sega channel back in '94, but it did arrive over here, at least for a short time, right at the end of the console's life. The Sega channel in the UK was operated by a company called Telewest, who would eventually end up being bought out by Virgin Media. The southeast was one of Telewest's big areas, and the Sega channel launched in this region first in June of 1996, although I didn't end up getting the channel until I think about early '97. And yeah, it worked much the same as it did in the US. In fact, the Sega channel would even provide the games in NTSC. Needless to say, there weren't all that many people who had a Sega channel, but we were one of the lucky few. And just, oh boy, what a glorious thing it was. It's not just Aerobiz Supersonic that came from the Sega channel, so many other brilliant games were on the service, including some we'd never seen here, like Shadowrun or Romance of the Three Kingdoms 3. I remember that the Sega channel was the first time I'd played games like Shining Force 2, or Ranger X, or The Story of 4, or Phantasy Star 2. American users of the Sega channel will probably also note games like Pulseman, Alien Soldier and Mega Man The Wily Wars, all of them games that were never physically released in the US. And of course there's all the other brilliant games that we were all so familiar with along with it. The first day of the month became a special event, usually an all-nighter as you would wait to see what the next lot of games would bring, usually at around 5 in the morning. And that wasn't everything. There was a lot of content that was exclusive purely to the Sega channel, mostly in the test drive section which was usually used for demos and the like. By the time I got the channel there weren't really all that many demos, but I remember 3 things specifically. A special Lost Levels edition of the otherwise humdrum licensed platformer Garfield Caught in the Act, an exclusive demo of the MD version of Virtua Fighter 2, and a wholly exclusive game called Klondike. This was basically a version of Solitaire, but still, you could only get it on the Sega channel, and you can't get it anywhere now, as is the case with a lot of Sega channel stuff. The nature of the system it used meant that it was pretty much impossible to actually capture or dump any of the ROM images or channels that it used. It may well have been possible to do such a thing now, I suppose, but back then there certainly wasn't anyone who was interested in preserving all of this or any of the other content on there. Every game pretty much had an entire strategy guide and walkthrough to go along with it, along with a full copy of the manual, and there was also a rolling news ticker that provided you with info on various deals, competitions, new releases and what have you. You can see some examples here. And while the finished channel didn't look exactly like this, it was indeed as gloriously 90s as you would expect, with all those freaky backgrounds and music provided by John Baker, who also did the music for Toe Jam and Earl. Still, when the channel was discontinued, alas, all of this disappeared along with it. And of course that had to happen eventually. Time was not on the Sega channel's side. The Sega channel was discontinued over here around the early part of 1998, and by all accounts was finished basically everywhere by May of that year. Almost everyone can agree that it was an absolutely brilliant creation, way ahead of its time. When you consider that every console these days has an on-demand game service, even though this wasn't strictly the same thing, it was a total pioneer. It was years before we would see anything like this on a console again. But in the end, it didn't help all that much in increasing the Mega Drive's fan base. Sega of Japan's decree in early 1995 that all development and support for the Mega Drive worldwide should cease to make way for the Saturn basically killed any hope of that. And while the Sega channel had a faithful core, it was never going to grow beyond. It wasn't in enough cities in the US and whatnot. The infamously terrible decision happened only a few months after the channel's initial launch in America after all. And still, the fact that it spurred a sizable number of Mega Drive users considering the coverage that it had, which wasn't a great deal, as well as a few latecomers, into sticking with the system right to the bitter end, even in the face of the PlayStation and the N64, shows just how much potential it had. If Sega had managed to launch the channel a couple of years earlier, or even a year earlier, while the console war was still at its peak, who knows what sort of effect it would have had. But alas, it wasn't to be. As mentioned, precious little information exists about the Sega channel because all we have here is based on demo cartridges. It's kinda similar to Prodigy or something like that, I suppose. There are a couple of videos on YouTube of the channel in operation, thanks to brilliant people like Azurite Reaction who recorded themselves using it at the time and then put the vids on the internet later, and if you're interested or just want a bit of nostalgia, I highly suggest you check them out. The Sega channel. Perhaps the single most glorious creation of the Mega Drive era. Much loved and sorely missed. And so we get to Aerobiz Supersonic, a game that we are covering because for me it is the definitive example of a Sega channel gem. A game that wasn't available over here, a game about a completely unique subject that you'd barely ever see on a PC, let alone on a console, and a game that turned out to be absolutely amazing. It's quite special to me. So, let's go. First off, you can choose from various scenarios, from a neat post-war scenario to what's still just about the present day. This doesn't just affect what planes are on offer, it affects what world events are going to take place, what the relations are going to be like between different countries and so forth. After you choose a scenario, you pick where exactly you want to start from. A nice big capital city is usually your best bet. As you might expect, starting somewhere in Europe or North America will usually give you a few more options than, say, starting in Oceania. And then, everyone else picks theirs, because that's one of the most important things to note about Aerobiz. Yes, it is an airline one in simulation, but it's also very much a competition. In every game you have 3 other airlines to compete against, and you win by being the number 1 in the world and fulfilling all the victory requirements, having a hub in every continent, and being the number 1 airline in 5 regions for a year. You get 20 years to achieve this, and you get 4 turns in a year. Whoever's top of the tree at the end wins. Simple. Or not, as the case may be. And yes, if you wish, all 4 airlines can be controlled by another human player. You can even watch the game being simmed if you like. Aerobiz Supersonic, for what it is a tough and very fast-paced game. You've got to make the most out of every turn. You have 4 executives you can use for various things, and once they're locked into doing something, they're out for as little as 3 months or as long as 12 months. You use them mostly for negotiating slots with a city that allow you to open up a route to there, but they also set up hubs, buy business ventures, and run ad campaigns. How long they take over this depends on all sorts of different factors, not just how far away the location is, but mainly what the relations between the different countries are like. For example, if you're operating out of New York, is negotiating for slots in Tehran really a good idea if it's going to take 12 months, putting the executive out for 4 whole turns, and only ending up with like 2 slots out of the deal because the countries don't like each other? That's an extreme example, but you've always got to be thinking ahead. It's no good just buying stuff willy-nilly, you have to work towards a goal. 20 years sounds like a long time, but do the math and it works out to 80 turns, which isn't much at all. A game of Aerobiz can very easily be all but won in the first 10 turns or so if one airline executes a good plan. They're already set up, they've expanded, and no other airline can get enough customers from them to truly have an impact on their lead in the time allowed. The whole thing makes for a fantastic challenge, forever pondering over every move. And yeah, those executives are never going to have a break. Any executive sitting on their arse is basically losing you potential money. Send them to all 4 corners of the earth. Who cares if they never see their family again? Gotta go fast, there's slots in Mundane to take care of. A turn in Aerobiz can be quick or slow, but you should always be doing as much as you can. All this is well and good, but as an airline you're obviously going to need some planes. You can buy them at any time from the big old plane shop without losing a turn. They take 3 months for delivery. Funnily enough, Aerobiz actually qualifies as a licensed game. Curry spent the cash to have all real airplanes here. Boeing, Airbus, McConnell Douglas, Tupolev, Ilyushin, you name it. You've got to have a wide array of planes, from smaller ones that are good for short haul flights to the big jumbo jets that will fly to the other side of the world. You don't want to go overboard naturally. It's no good having a bunch of planes just sitting there doing nothing, so buy not too much, just enough. And naturally new planes are being introduced all the time, so it's worth replacing obsolete ones with something that can do the job better. The other big thing in the game is world events, which for the most part correspond with actual history. A good example is the Olympics. They come once every 4 years and result in a massive boost of tourism in that city. So if you know your Olympic cities, setting up a route a couple of turns in advance is a pretty good idea. There's also wars and such to consider. For example, starting a game as a Middle East city in the 60s, that's going to be tough. There's strife everywhere and basically everyone doesn't like you. Definitely a challenge for seasoned players. In the end, it's all about getting a load of passengers and making money. You get a massive boatload of cash to spend at first, but it's all got to go towards setting up consistent and large income, for that is usually how you end up winning the game. And then there's taking control of multiple regions, usually pretty damn tough, especially if another airline's got a tight control over one of them. A 12-month ad campaign might take out an executive for a while, but it could be worth it if it wins customers your way. There's so many different decisions you've got to take, always something to consider, and that's why it's such an exciting game. One of the other great features is that at any point you can get your executives together for a meeting and get an overview of your current situation as well as what might be some useful advice, but at least you'll always be able to figure out where you stand. While the game is undoubtedly complex, it's never not welcoming. All the information you need to run your airline is there for you and easy to access. It's a beautifully constructed game. And the funky, business-style elevator music that accompanies everything? It's kind of cool in its own way. Even that one tune that utterly rips off Eric Clapton's Tears in Heaven, that is exactly what you would hear going up to the elevator on the 78th floor of your building, isn't it? Curry on the whole built a certain reputation in the 16-bit era. They made a lot of these complex, strategic games, some of which could be seen as quite dry. They made games like Pacific Theatre of Operations, which were really damn difficult to understand in all honesty, as well as other games that struck more of a balance like the excellent Liberty or Death or Genghis Khan Clan of the Grey Wolf. They even made faster paced strategy games that were quick and easy to understand, like the brilliant and wholly underrated Gemfire. And of course, they worked on what was at the time their marquee series, Romance of the Three Kingdoms. The third iteration of that series, Dragon of Destiny, is another Sega Channel gem and one that will probably end up being covered in a later video. They loved their historical gems and they loved their business games, and they didn't give a hoot if no one else did, although most of these games were massive in Japan so it didn't matter. But this, it might just be the best out of all of them. It is wonderful. Easy to pick up and play without feeling as though it's in any way compromised through being on a console. Anytime you set up a new route, it's a joy, a new journey, a pathway to what might end up being prosperity. Even if you've basically squandered your money on everything else and you're probably going to go bankrupt soon, it's another roll of the dice, a sense that this might just be the winner. What sets the ball rolling? You're going to get a route somewhere and suddenly the tourism's just going to boom in that city and you'll be making money end over end. There's the classic simulation joy of setting up something, whether it's a city or a business, but also the thrill of competing against others to be the best. It's everything that could ever possibly be entertaining about capitalism without ever actually harming anybody. One of the absolute greatest games of the 16-bit era. It takes a special bunch of people to make planning a route as exciting as anything else out there. And Curry? They were those people. So there you have it. The brilliance of Aerobiz Supersonic and the story of the almighty Sega Channel. On the whole, I'm not sure if I've ever done any video that's more of a loving than this one, and being positive is my baseline basically. Whatever you came here for, whether it's one of the greatest peripherals ever or one of the greatest games ever, hopefully you had fun. For now though, I've got a 12-month date in Sapporo with a ruthless executive, a plate full of Danish pastry, and a fistful of slots. Such is life. I'll see you on the other side. Bye! How's about more Sega arcade action? We've got a double header today, 2 arcade classics that just so happen to be linked by the word Alien. Neither are big enough for a full retrospective, but together, well, it's certainly murder. The murder of a hell of a lot of disgusting creatures. It's Alien Syndrome and Alien Storm. We'll start with the earlier one. Alien Syndrome came out in 1987, right during the time when Sega were making a lot of bank through much flashier games, all of that super scalar goodness. This game by comparison is a lot more simpler. It has more in common with the likes of Quartet and Phantasy Zone, and was made using the same System 16 board by the AM1 arcade division. However, as was common at the time, Sega's coders weren't allowed to take any credits, and so no one knows who actually designed this game. Anyway, the year is 2000 AD, and a horde of homicidal aliens have taken over several spaceships. It's your job to rescue the hostages and defeat the menace. You play as either Ricky or Mary, or both if you have a friend, and get ready to kick some ass. It doesn't exactly take much guessing to figure out where the inspiration for this game lies, does it? Yep, the game wouldn't exist without the Alien movies. You've got the desolate settings, HR Giga nightmares, and hell, even xenomorphs that are thoroughly cribbed from the movies. It shouldn't be a surprise also that Ricky and Mary also look kinda like Michael Biehn and Sigourney Weaver. The only thing this game doesn't have that stops it from being a tie-in is, of course, an official license. Games being inspired by Alien aren't anything new, of course, but Alien Syndrome is one of the earliest ones to really get tons of mileage out of it. As far as arcade games go, it's quite different. Low-key. Honestly, a little unsettling. The usual big Sega soundtrack is forgotten in favour of minimal synths and an atmosphere. The design of the enemies is really something, especially the bosses, which really get the body horror themes that Giga was going for. They're beautifully vile. And then there's the screams of death, which kinda stick in your brain. It may be a 1980s arcade game, but there's not much doubt that when you screw up, your heroes are suffering a quite painful demise. And you best get used to hearing those screams because this is one of the hardest arcade games of them all. It's a top-down nightmare, crawling with aliens who will all kill you in a single hit. You get 3 lives and there are no continues, my friend. You have to rescue at least 10 hostages in each of the 6 levels before fighting a boss, and all the while you have an incredibly strict time limit to contend with. If you don't complete the level in time, then a big bomb goes off and the game is over. The levels themselves are challenging enough, but the bosses? Yeah, they can ruin you. In some cases, if you don't fight them properly, you simply won't have enough time to get the job done against them, and that's if they don't just kill you outright. They almost all have tiny windows during which you can attack them, and it's very risky to get close. In short, this game is a severe challenge indeed. Our heroes do have a few different weapons that can help them, of course. Good thing too, as the default plasma cannon you have is basically useless. The laser has a slow rate, but pierces enemies and has the best range. The flamethrower may not have much range, but it provides continuous fire. And the fireball is powerful as hell, but has an arc, so you've got to have the correct distance. None of these are overpowered in the slightest. You can't rely on any weapons as much as you have to rely on the skill you've amassed through death after death, but they all have their users. There were also maps and warps dotted through the levels which can be handy for getting to the last hostages. Alien Syndrome is in many ways all about practice. The first time you play this, you're going to die very quickly. More than a lot of games, you slowly develop a route through the game with every attempt. This path is largely unaffected by random occurrences and is based on getting through each level as quickly as possible while getting the captives and the ideal weaponry for the boss, and then learning the boss. It's hard and it takes time. Is it the best thing? That's debatable. Some people don't like these exercises in rote memorization, but the challenge of the game is such that the slightest mistake and deviation will usually result in disaster. It's like walking on a tightrope. Alien Syndrome is certainly memorable, considering that most of Sega's standout cabinets were famed for their spectacular special effects or their fantastic gimmicks. Alien Syndrome achieves excellence without deploying any of them. It's certainly addicting, and it's a game that'll keep you for a while, even if it's not for everyone. It's nice to play an arcade game that goes for something different like this one does, and if it did have an official license, well, it'd easily be one of the best Aliens games. On the whole, it'll brutalise you, but it will be worth it. And now it's time to look at the ports. The natural way to start is with the Master System. The graphics are kinda there, but not much else. It loses something play-wise, mainly because it's a flip screen game now for some reason. It's also a lot harder, mainly because enemies now fade onto the screen instead of just being there, which usually makes for cheap deaths when a monster is suddenly right on top of you. The death screams are even harsher though. On the whole, it's an port. The layout is slightly different too, but they could have done better with this. The NES port of the game, handled by Sunsoft and released unofficially in the US by Tengen, is actually a lot better. While the atmosphere isn't there at all in this version, it doesn't play too badly, and the result is a pretty nice top-down shooter. You have to rescue all of the hostages in a level, mind, which can be a little annoying at times. That said, it's nowhere near as hard as the original. I believe you have continues in this one as well. Moving on to computers then, where there's a fair few versions, the majority of them handled by Ace Software. The C64 version isn't too bad. The sound and graphics are great, but one thing hurts it, and that's the screwed up scrolling. For whatever reason, you only scroll when you're on the extreme sides of the screen, meaning more cheap deaths when you just don't have time to react to a monster. Shame. Otherwise good. The Amiga, PC and Atari ST versions are all basically the same as each other. Again, you need to rescue all the captives in a level. All of them are a decent version of the game, although they are missing levels. I'd go for the Amiga one personally because the sound is fantastic and booming on this version. The Spectrum port is technically fine, but lacking. This is a game that kinda needs the sound, and the 48K just doesn't have it. The Amstrad CPC has some of the sound, but it's just wretched, horrendously slow, and probably the worst port of the lot. As far as the best ports of the game go, however, there are two clear winners. First is the SharpX 68000. This port didn't come out until 1992 and there's not much to say about it really. It is, for all intents and purposes, arcade perfect, so it's obviously a bang-up job. The second one is a bit more left field though. Alien Syndrome for the Sega Game Gear. Again, this came out in 1992 and is in many ways a sequel to the original. It takes place 5 years after. The layouts are very different, but the enemies, bosses and general aim remain. And the result is a fantastic version of the game, miles better than the Master System version despite the hardware similarities. The atmosphere's a bit different, but it's such a good player. It'd give the arcade version a run for its money. So yeah, this is the best port of the game, and as far as the Game Gear goes, it's one of the best games you can get for it. It's definitely worthy of being called a hidden gem. But of course we're still not done. There are two more modern takes on the game to look at. First up is the Sega Ages 2500 version for the PS2. This isn't one of the bad Ages games, although it does make a lot of changes. Obviously it's a lot darker now that it's 3D, lots of lighting and stuff. On the whole, it's much easier. You get an energy bar for a start. The playing is much the same and isn't too bad at all. It's a decent and cheap top-down shooter, even if it's not going to be a patch on the original. It's alright. And then we have a full-blown sequel that came out for the Wii and PSP. This changes things up even more. Now there's RPG elements related to the progression of your character. It's a much slower game too, very different to the first one. Does it work? Yeah. It's a really dark and ugly game for a start. Also, on the Wii, it naturally makes use of silly waggling minigames. And it just doesn't have that intensity, not even the intensity of the PS2 version. It's a noble attempt at modernisation, but in the end you can't really fix something like the original. All the lighting tricks and cutscenes can't match up with such effective simplicity. I'd skip this one, to be honest with you. On to something different then. Although both games have Alien in the title, Alien Storm is largely a separate affair. Whereas Alien Syndrome went for the horror HR Giga style vibe, Alien Storm it's pretty mad. It's less body horror, more B-movie, a game inspired by cheap monster flicks and all the good stuff you'd see at the drive-in. Much like Alien Syndrome though, it was another popular game in the arcade, and one that generated a lot of ports. Unlike Alien Syndrome, we also know who made it. This is the fourth game made by Team Shinobi and designed by Makoto Uchida, previously of Shinobi, naturally, Altered Beast and Golden Axe. We seem to be covering his stuff a lot lately. As mentioned previously in the Golden Axe vid, Uchida grew up with a lot of Western culture around him. He was inspired by Conan and the like for Golden Axe, and here he drew on classic B-movie flicks, although there is another modern film that could be thanked too. I mean, it's probably no coincidence that our three heroes drive around in a big van marked Alien Busters. Alien Storm as a game is made of 3 parts. The first is a typical beat-em-up a la Golden Axe, where your heroes clear the streets of aliens using their weapons. They have different attacks such as a dash and a roll, lots of finishing moves, and some crazy specials ranging from dropping bombs from space to a frickin' nuke. Don't ask me why I said nuke just clears the enemies on the screen instead of razing the whole stage to the ground, but hey ho. The other big part of the stage is a shooting gallery, a la Operation Wolf. You use your ray guns to kill a whole bunch of aliens and smash the surroundings apart without any care whatsoever for collateral damage. The least common section is running and shooting. These are fairly short and only appear a couple of times. All the while we get lots of funny things happening. The streets are filled with people running scared, usually with aliens munching on their backs. Or sometimes they transform into creatures themselves and you have to fight them. The design isn't exactly as icky as Alien Syndrome, but it's still pretty creative. It does help that the game is generally a lot of fun. It's similar to Golden Axe to the point where the 3 characters even somewhat look like their fantasy counterparts, with the obvious exception of Scooter the robot, who still basically fills the Gilius role in the trio, but it works fine and the different stages do help to change the game up. It's not perfect though. I kinda feel that the game's missing a few things to make it really stand out. I wish it had more bosses. The game only has 2, the final fight at the end, which is a shooting stage, and a brilliant free-formed Hellbeast in the middle of the game. That's a fantastic fight, and I wish the game had more of them. The other problem is, well, the last stages. It looks like it's only going to get better once the mother alien actually swallows you whole and transports you to space with the aim to destroy it from the inside, but the last stages are literally the same 3 corridors repeated 3 times. Kinda feels like that bit was knocked together in 5 minutes, which is a shame. Don't ask me why there's a drinks cabinet in an alien ship though. Still, with enough coins you'll beat it, and the Alien Busters van will take you back to Earth where you'll be judged by your peers, including, amusingly enough, Julius Thunderhead from Golden Axe. Even if they weren't allowed to properly credit themselves, Team Shinobi certainly did make attempts to stand out. Their previous 3 games all get advertised here too. With 2 players, or even 3, Alien Storm is spectacular. Still underrated, it's one of the best beat-em-ups for multiplayer just because of the variation and competitive nature of the game. In single player it's not quite as great, but it's still fun enough and worth going through on main, especially if you like a B-movie type affair. It's fun to compare this with Alien Syndrome to see just how completely different they are in every way, but both are pretty good at what they do. And once again, there were plenty of different ways to have a crack at Alien Storm in the home. Seeing as we're in 1990 now, the obvious first place to go for Alien Storm in the home is the Mega Drive. We've got a thoroughly decent conversion here. While it's not arcade perfect, obviously, it is right in line with, say, the Mega Drive version of Golden Axe. Hell, it even features a dual mode. The game does actually make a few changes when compared to the arcade. The stage order has been shifted around a little bit, which isn't a bad change as the original could feel a little out of order in this regard. One very good change is that the number of boss encounters has been increased. Instead of just having that one big free-form battle in the middle of the game, here you face said boss 3 times, each time in its different forms, which breaks things up quite nicely. On the whole, it's a very solid conversion. There is one issue people do tend to have with it, and that is very easy. You get tons of credits, and to be honest, it's harder to lose the game than it is to beat it. This is certainly an issue people had at the time. As it goes, there's one way to remedy this, and that's to play the Japanese version of the game, which cuts the credits in half and generally plays a much tougher game. I did this unintentionally, thinking for a bit that the game was certainly harder than I thought it was, until I realised that I have a Japanese Mega Drive, and therefore I'm basically getting the hard mode. Generally, most of the arcade fun is here though, and it's a bang-up job. The Master System version of Alien Storm came out in PAL territories only, and it's actually also not bad. It does cut out one character, but it moves a lot smoother than, say, the Master System Golden Axe. Again, it's also a fair challenge. I certainly couldn't get through it, and enemies do tend to snipe at you. Life pickups tend to be thin on the ground in Alien Storm as opposed to the energy for special weapons, so do expect to be firing a lot of nukes off in order to get through sticky situations. It's not a bad port at all. And then there's the computer versions, all of which were done by the almighty US Gold. As you might expect, it's a mixed bag. The Amiga and ST versions are, well, alas, they're diabolical. The graphics are there, sure, but the sound certainly isn't, and the controls are irritating beyond belief. You have a few functions available to you in Alien Storm, and these guys just couldn't manage it with one button. I wouldn't recommend this even a little bit, a very poor effort. Surprisingly enough, the game fares better on 8 bits. The C64 version plays nicely, has a bunch of enemies on screen, and decent music. It's a very solid arcade conversion considering the hardware. The Speccy? Yeah, not bad. They certainly tried given the very limited resources, and although the controls are quite iffy, it's not unplayable. Amstrad has the colour advantage as usual, and the play is a little bit nicer here. On the whole, a half decent showing. Probably one of the US Gold's better conversions, certainly when it comes to the smaller micros. And there it is. We are done with these 2 Sega arcade gems. Hopefully you've enjoyed this look back at the pair of them, and it's something that, well, it isn't Halloween anymore, so you don't have much of a reason to be scared, but you can still get some nice residuals and creep yourself out with them on a dark night. Bye for now. This is going to be a video of 2 halves, I suppose. My original aim was to make a simple little video about 2 Sega games. One for the Master System, one for the Mega Drive. One good, one bad, but both very similar. Good old Black Belt and Last Battle. Simple enough, lots of people know these titles, they've probably got plenty of memories of them, good and bad, and I get to talk about an insanely popular license in the bargain. But then there's the real oddity. How on earth did Last Battle end up on UK microcomputers? And well, that took me down another rabbit hole entirely. A whole bunch of Sega Mega Drive games that somehow ended up on platforms like the Amiga, the C64, even the Amstrad and the ZX Spectrum. Such treasure troves are why making these videos is pretty awesome. But to start things off, well, let's do the video I was going to make first. Black Belt and Last Battle. The story of these classic, some might call them that I suppose, Sega games. And obviously we can't not talk about the license they spawned from first. A lot of you probably know that both Black Belt and Last Battle are Western localizations of Japanese games based on the manga and anime series Hokuto no Ken, or as it's generally known over here, Fist of the North Star. Well aside from various places in Europe where it's called Ken the Survivor, particularly France. Now, I don't claim to be an expert on anime, it's not my field, but this is definitely something I can get behind. Hokuto no Ken is a post-apocalyptic tale focusing on the adventures of Kenshiro, master of the martial art of Hokuto Shinken. He protects the weak from Gan's roamingly irradiated wastelands with a ruthless streak. Those who on Kenshiro are, more often than not, likely to be met with 100 or so rapid-fire punches and kicks delivered to their hidden pressure points. They may laugh it off, thinking that all those hits and screams of "at" didn't amount to much. But then Ken says those magic words, "Ome wa mo shinderu," meaning, you are already dead. Anyone who hears this is probably about to suddenly blow up, violently and graphically, from the inside. Especially if they answer with a baffled shout of, "Nani?" Now there's obviously a lot more to Hokuto no Ken than all of that, but these are the immediate elements that make the story pretty bloody awesome. One of those that managed to easily break out of Japan and become famous the world over. I didn't actually realise just how huge a franchise it is. Between the original manga and TV show, films, merch, games, pachinko and so on, it's estimated that Hokuto no Ken has made around $20 billion in its lifetime. To put that into context, that's actually more than the likes of James Bond and Toy Story. Not bad. It's hardly a niche thing to be sure. And just to bring it all back, a nuclear wasteland, a muscular guy, a propensity for punching and kicking people until they implode? If that's not perfect fodder for a load of video games, then frankly I have no idea what is. The first Hokuto no Ken game was actually released on the PC-88 Japanese computer in May 1986, and it was a graphical adventure called Hokuto no Ken Violence Giga Adventure. But it would only be another 2 months until we got something a bit more arcadey and side-scrolling. July 1986 saw the release of Hokuto no Ken on the Sega Mark III, the original Japanese Master System. The game is, from what I can tell, a pretty straight adaptation of the original Hokuto no Ken series plot, featuring most of the famous battles against the likes of Shin, Devil's Rebirth, Toki and others, culminating in the final battle against Rail, the King of Fists, and being reunited with his girlfriend, Yuria. Most of the stages are broken into 2 parts. First up you have a side-scrolling section where Kenshiro beats the living cack out of various goons, interspersed with battles against various sub-bosses. Again, these are also mostly characters from the series. After that, you get a straight one-on-one fight between Kenshiro and the boss that's, well, more of a fighting game. Even if you only have a sliver of health at the end of a stage, you'll still get a maxed out health bar for the last fight. And the sprites get bigger too. Is this game good, Len? Yeah, it's really good actually. It's one of my favourite titles on the Master System. Although I do mostly know it as something else entirely. Later on in 1986, this game was released in the West as Black Belt, complete with awesome minimalistic Master System box art and without the Hokuto no Ken license, presumably because the series hadn't actually officially been released in the West yet. Kenshiro is turned into Riki, a more generic karate man complete with a gi that he wears everywhere, just in case you weren't sure whether he knew martial arts or not. The setting becomes more contemporary, no wastelands here, and the plot becomes a regular damsel in distress affair where you save your girlfriend Kyoko by defeating the evil crime boss Wan and his various underlings, such as a sumo wrestler and a female bodyguard. There's also lots of awkward translations in the manual. Your girlfriend has got herself into a beautiful Japanese mess, and there's the guarantee that Riki will get to fight all sorts of people, such as Rita, the flamethrower, a ninja with a red whip and a red sword. And, dark women. Nothing else, just dark women. I guess Riki has a white hood somewhere to go with that white gi. And, well, let's face it, for certain people with an incredibly immature sense of humour, the name Wan is never not going to be funny. So far, so generic, but the action is still the same and it still plays great. There's a few tweaks to the gameplay. Black Belt is a bit easier on account of the addition of health power-ups and even invincibility that you can pick up with a high jump as they scroll across the screen. Riki sure does love his nigiri. You also regain health by defeating sub-bosses, which aside from some hidden Easter eggs was the only way to get health back in the original Japanese game. Still, even with the backgrounds and characters all redone, the game is basically the same. Obviously the graphics and sprites are a lot more memorable in the Japanese game, which is beautifully done in 8 bits with a bit of parallax even thrown in. The shifting sands of Southern Cross Town, Godland, the battle against Devil's Rebirth where he's actually a lot bigger than you. All of these are way more memorable than Black Belt's generic city or harbour settings. It may be a tougher game, but the Japanese original is definitely better, even if I've played Black Belt a lot more. It does surprise me, thinking about it, that the boss fights are largely the same in both games. They're the most memorable part of the game, and they're actually quite odd and puzzle-like, in a way that actually makes them faithful to the show. The bosses all have a certain weakness, and they usually have to be finished a certain way once they lose all of their health. For example, the first boss, Shin, or Rear in Black Belt, has to be beaten with a punch, which triggers Kenshiro's most famous finishing move, the Hokuto Hakuretsu Ken, or 100 Rending Fists. As in the show, the move's title appears on the screen when you perform it. Surprisingly, this was kept in the Western version. The enemies exploding into little pieces was also kept in, by the way, meaning that this game had the honour of being banned in Germany until 2012. The bosses get more complex as you go. The fourth boss, Toki, known as the ninjutsu Oni in Black Belt, counters all your moves. The only way to beat him is to go all the way to the left and match him blow for blow with kicks. You'll both hit each other, but you'll have that one sliver of health more than him at the end. Sorta like the fight against Malf in the original NES Ninja Gaiden. The fifth boss, Salfa, who gets gender swapped into Rita, Wan's bodyguard in Black Belt, is even more complex. You must hit him with a set sequence of moves, that being jump kick, standing punch, and low kick. You do this twice, and then to actually beat him, you have to wait until he does a dive kick and then catch him right before he lands with a kick of your own. Hard to pull off, but certainly satisfying. Reo, or Wan, is the last boss and, well, he's really tough and doesn't seem to have much in any way of weaknesses. However, you can glitch him out by going to the left side, waiting for him to jump at you, and then stun locking him in the air with low punches before delivering the final hit. So these bosses aren't strictly like your plain Jane everyday fighting game, but they're still quite a lot of fun to actually figure out. In summary, this game's bloody great, whether you play the original or its non-apocalyptic Western equivalent. It seems as though some people criticised it back in the day as being a bit derivative of the game Kung Fu, in that they're both martial arts based side-scrollers, but I'd say that if that's the case, this is a much improved version of that game's formula, with so much more added to it. And as far as Sega goes, there's another reason why this title was important. It was one of the first titles for the company where a young man by the name of Yuji Naka took the role of lead programmer, which is certainly historic. Sonic and all that. As far as performance goes, it's certainly fondly remembered in Japan as one of the better Hokuto no Ken games, even if the Mark III wasn't a great selling console. I'm not too sure about the US, but here in the UK where the Master System was popular, well, without having figures to hand, most people I knew with a Master System tended to have a copy of Black Belt, including yours truly, so I can't imagine it did badly. Sega have happily kept the game's memory alive over the years. A 3D update of Hokuto no Ken was released in 2004 as part of the Sega Ages series on PS2, although I don't believe that's supposed to be much cop. And the original game is also an unlockable extra in the license's most recent game, 2018's Hokuto Gagatoku, or Fist of the North Star Lost Paradise. For a long time, and leaving aside the Japanese-only graphic adventures and RPGs that the series got, the Sega Hokuto no Ken was the best game that the series had. It's fair to say that a lot of the other more actiony titles weren't that great. Take the ones that were on the Famicom, for example. The first one, released by Toei. This game is absolutely hideous. Unappealing graphics, horrid music, plays like a scabby dog. The Sega game is better in every possible way. But, being on the much more popular Famicom, this game was a success and apparently sold 1.5 million copies. Hell, it seems as though quite a lot of people in the West, particularly in America, played this title back in the day, even though it was never officially released in English. I wonder if it was on some sort of unlicensed bootleg cart, or if it was simply imported by lots of Kenshiro-loving otakus or expats. Toei's second effort on the Famicom, Hokuto no Ken 2, is a lot better, although still a pretty ban-average side-scroller. Mind you, this one was the first title from the license to officially be released in the West as Fist of the North Star in 1989, tying in with the original English adaptation of the manga. I sort of have a soft spot for this game as it was one of the first NES games that I played on Nesticle back in the day, but it is very cookie cutter and, again, not a patch on the Sega game. And so we move to the 16-bits. You would think that on the 16-bits there'd be even more action titles based on Kenshiro's antics, perhaps a Final Fight-style beat-em-up, or just even more bombastic side-scrolling and goon-exploding action in general. Surprisingly, that's not really the case. There were a couple of one-on-one fighters for the Super Famicom, but there were also more RPGs and graphic adventures. In fact, there's only one 16-bit Hokuto no Ken side-scroller, that being Sega's follow-up to their original 8-bit classic that, unfortunately, isn't anywhere near as good. The Mega Drive game, released in mid-1989, has the catchy title, sorry for the inevitably botched pronunciation, Shin Sekimatsu Kuseshu Densetsu Hokuto no Ken, which roughly translates to Fist of the North Star, the new legend of the post-apocalyptic messiah. I think we'll just call it Hokuto no Ken 2. It picks up just about from where the original left off, with Kenshiro travelling to the land of Asura and facing off this time against the three Rasho who rule the land, Han, Hyo and Kaio. There will be many other named enemies to fight along the way, although Kenshiro has a few allies who this time will help him. Once again, the game's plot is taken from story arcs in the original manga, and once again the game was released in the West as something pretty different. If you're English, chances are you know this game as Last Battle. Even though by this point Fist of the North Star was becoming more known as a commodity, Sega didn't release it under that name in the West. Possibly because Toei got there first with their NES game? I'm not sure. As it goes, this time the English version is a lot closer to the Japanese one in terms of plot. Everyone's names have changed, with Kenshiro now known as Arzak, the main boss Kaio called Garok, other characters such as Max, Alyssa, Duke and so on. But the actual plot hasn't really been changed, the backgrounds remain the same, and only a few sprites have been tampered with in any way. Even the somewhat corny subtitle, Legend of the Final Hero, is kinda similar to the Japanese game's one, while also alluding to one of Kenshiro's nicknames, the Saviour of Century's End. While it's obvious that the Japanese version is a sequel to Hokuto no Ken on the Mark III, Last Battle is so different in appearance to Black Belt that you likely wouldn't think the two were related if you didn't know any better. The main difference between the two versions is, of course, censorship. When you hit enemies in Hokuto no Ken 2, they will explode in a fountain of blood. Some of the game's bosses will suffer even more gruesome deaths in the classic style. They'll expand all over their body and then blow up in a sea of viscera. None of this was retained in Last Battle. Here enemies just fly off the screen, and any of the more graphic boss deaths are dealt with by changing the colour red to green or yellow. Other than that, well, there's not an awful lot of difference really, and so I did most of my capture for this just playing Last Battle, in order to really embrace the game's awkward translation and, well, not very good gameplay. Last Battle was a launch title for the Mega Drive in both the US and Europe, and you know how most console launchers always have that one title that's just, you know, not a standout? Something like the Kung Fu, Genji, Cameo, all those NES sports games and so on? Well, Last Battle is the ugly duckling of the Mega Drive's Western launch lineup, the one that had people shaking their heads, wondering why on earth it was chosen as a system showcase. The game was brutally panned almost everywhere, and magazines of the time even saw fit to repeatedly cite it as one of the worst games on the whole system. Is that fair? Not at all. Last Battle's main crime, really, is plain old aggressive mediocrity. It falls down compared to the Master System game in various ways. Firstly, well, it's just a lot slower. What once moved at a pretty good clip on the 8-bits seems to be quite a slog on 16, with Kenshiro, or Arzak, moving ponderously forward through backgrounds that are pretty This is especially true of the game's maze levels, which are, to say the least, uninspiring and not a welcome addition. It's a much longer game too, split into 4 chapters, each with multiple stages. There's a map screen between each one and you don't have to visit every single location, but there's still a lot more game here than there was on the Master System. Alas, it's just not quite as good a game. Once you've beaten up enough goons for Kenshiro to rip off his vest and get his power up, you're normally best off brute forcing your way through each stage trying to take on as few enemies as possible, which isn't exactly all that fun. Another criticism that's often aimed at the game is based on the high difficulty level. Not only is the game a long slog, but you only have one energy bar. Once it runs out, game over, and there aren't at all that many opportunities to get that bar back up. Indeed, most opportunities rely on you getting through the odd level or defeating sub-bosses, which is a tough task if you only have a sliver of health left. It is possible to get some health back in the mazes by going through the odd door and beating as many enemies as possible before being kicked out again, but yeah, it's kind of brutal. All hope is not lost, however. Few actually mention this, but the game does have a continue feature. After your inevitable death, you need to sit through the game's prologue text, which weirdly is literally the entire story of the game, and then when Legend of the Final Hero, or its Japanese equivalent, pops up, hold ABC and press start. By doing this, you're able to continue from the chapter you died in with a full health bar. Even still, it's a very tough game, one of those games where you die by 1,000 cuts, as even if you're playing well, taking the odd hit here and there and not having much opportunity for recovery can put you in a bad spot, usually around the time you're fighting a boss. Speaking of bosses, that's another area where the game kinda falls down compared to the Master System. A lot of the bosses there are quite fun to figure out, having the puzzle elements and whatnot. Here, not really. For most of the bosses, the best tactic is simply to chip away at them, hit a jump kick, then back off before you get countered. Or sometimes just hammer the buttons blindly. It's somewhat more simplistic and disappointing, to be honest. And in some cases, quite cheap. The hit detection often feels way off, with strikes just not landing while the enemy strikes with impunity. The bosses are perhaps the least fun part of the game and, well, not a lot of it is all that fun. And despite all of that, I can't really hate or even dislike Last Battle. I almost have a certain fondness for the game despite its general lousy quality. I think the music's pretty nice at least, although it is also quite repetitive. The English plot is often hilariously corny, with classic lines like, "Now you have the look of a hero," or exchanges such as, "Arzak, save the world! I am the only one who can save this world!" It is kind of one of those B-movie sort of games. It's a bad game without a doubt, but there's enough in the silly enemies and plot that you can have a bit of a laugh with it. So, yeah, I have a soft spot for Last Battle, in all of its crappiness. I obviously recommend that if you're going to play this game, you probably want to play the original Japanese one, as it's basically the same, only with more blood and gore, and we all like a bit of that, don't we? But it still makes me smile a bit. Unlike the original Hokuto no Ken, Sega have not seen fit to celebrate the legacy of their 16-bit take on Kenshiro in any way, shape or form. And so, is that it? Not quite. Black Belt and Last Battle, or the two Sega Hokuto no Ken games, are both famous or infamous in their own way. As I said at the start, I expect a lot of people will have their own thoughts and memories of them in the comments. Hint hint. But there's something else. When doing my research, I couldn't help but notice that Last Battle appeared on other platforms. Computer platforms. This is something I wasn't really aware of at all, and needless to say, it's something I had to look at. So I hope you're ready for Last Battle on the Amiga. And that's not all. How about Last Battle on the Commodore 64? And indeed, how about a couple of other Mega Drive games that somehow ended up on these systems and more? Let's take a look. Last Battle, having impressed literally nobody on the Mega Drive, should by all rights have just stayed there. But it didn't. And for this we have Elite to thank. No, not the space pirating classic British game, the game publishers from Walsall. In 1990, Elite put it out there that they'd bought rights from Sega to convert not one, not two, but 3 Mega Drive games to computers, and not just to 16-bit platforms like the Amiga and the Atari ST, but even to 8-bit platforms like the C64 and Spectrum. That bit was a surprise. By this point, Elite were largely a 16-bit publisher, so the 8-bit mags of the time were kinda happy that they were throwing them a bone. Anyway, the 3 Mega Drive games in question were Last Battle, Arnold Palmer Tournament Golf, and World Championship Soccer, which if you're European, you know better as World Cup Italia 90. Not exactly the best and brightest games from the Mega Drive, it has to be said. Still, now you didn't even need to have the hottest console on the market in order to play its games. The games were slated for release later in 1990, although that date passed and eventually it appears that all 3 games hit the shelves sometime around the spring of 1991. We're going to have a look at all 3 of them to some degree, but obviously we're looking at Last Battle first. Let's start with the Amiga, shall we? Now, what with the Amiga's capabilities and this not being the most high fidelity game graphically as it is, I would expect this to be a pretty faithful conversion. And of course I would be one. Jeez, this game is slow. Way slower than the Mega Drive game. I mean, that felt kinda responsive at least, whereas this feels super delayed, and only having one button really doesn't help here. The graphics are very ugly too. There's less colours on show here of course, but the palette is just not nice. Still, none of these are the biggest crime. The biggest crime here is that, no word of a lie, this only contains half of the bloody game. 2 chapters. That's your lot. The game has most everything that's in those chapters, but once you get to what should be the pirate ship that breaks up chapters 2 and 3, you go to the final fight with Kaya instead. The entire second half of the game was not bothered with. The coders, in Paul Whitehouse style, seemingly said, "Sod this, anyone fancy a pint?" and buggered off. I mean, Jesus, who made this? Ah, Creative Materials. Perhaps that explains it. Responsible for such gems as eSWAT on the Spectrum, or Street Fighter 2 on the Amiga. These guys were the real ones you went to if you needed a port of something fast and dirty. Even if you gave them 2 days to do it in, they'd still probably come up with something even if it wasn't in any way playable. Occasionally you might get something intriguing from them, usually if their star coder, the somewhat mysterious Richard Applin, was involved, but most of the time, yeah, not a sign of quality. And alas, Elite gave the job of porting Last Battle to Lee's fellows. It's not exactly a good game to begin with, but on the Amiga, geez, it's considerably worse. It doesn't seem to have made much of a mark either. Barely previewed in any magazine, the conversion received just 1 review, a very negative one from the German mag Amiga Joker. Perhaps this explains why most people, including myself, were not previously aware of this port. What of the Commodore 64 version then? A different group took on this one, Images Software, a studio that specialised in ports and actually have a lengthy history under other banners such as Climax. This is the one I'm really intrigued about, I have to say. And what are the results? Well, it's not half bad, I suppose. It's still really slow, but then it's a speed that I would perhaps expect on here, even if the controls are still quite unresponsive. It's still a damn sight more playable than the Amiga version despite that. Oh, and guess what? It even features much more of the game. It's not all here, the maze stages have been excised, which is hardly a negative, and some of the bosses didn't make it, but all 4 chapters are present. Somehow, in spite of having way less power at their disposal, Images saw fit to include most of the game on the venerable C64, unlike Creative Materials. Not bad for a computer pushing double figures in age, eh? The main disappointment really is that there isn't much music. I was hoping for some rousing SID versions of the original game's music, but the game consists of just SFX, mostly Isaac's footsteps, which is a shame. Still, while this is hardly a game I'm ever going to play again, it's not a bad conversion. So that's Last Battle all done with, but what about those other 2 games? It's not like I'm going to get any other chance to look at them, so I may as well briefly see how they fared. First up, well, how about Arnold Palmer Tournament Golf, which made it to the Amiga, DOS and ST? Let's have a look. First off, the endorsement from Arnie didn't make it. The game is simply known as Tournament Golf, although the picture on the title screen is unmistakably Arnold Palmer. The game? Well, it's a mediocre golf game, just as it was on the Mega Drive. Very faithful in that regard, I suppose. The best thing about it is the music, and unfortunately that didn't make it over to the Amiga. But I was curious enough to test one thing. The most curious thing about the original game is its Easter eggs. Take over 100 shots to complete a hole, and you'll be greeted with either a drawing saying that the game's going to quit on your behalf, or, even better than that, a hidden game of Phantasy Zone. I wondered if the Amiga version would have anything similar, something that perhaps no one else has ever seen before. So I had a look, I hit the ball many times, over and over, and guess what? Nothing. Not a sausage. The score just rolled over 100 and carried on. What a bloody waste of time. So yeah, may as well just move on. So, what about World Championship Soccer? I already have a history of this game. I may have described it as the equivalent of a Rustler's Quarter Pounder, something that you know is absolute tripe, but that you guiltily and repeatedly come back to, usually when you simply can't think of anything else to play. And here it is on computers. Weirdly, under the name it was released in America. The European version of this game on Sega systems had some strange agreements between Sega, Mastertronic and I think Olivetti that allowed Sega to use the Italia 90 moniker, and needless to say these did not translate over to Elite's computer takes on the game. So how about the Amiga version first? Well, we've got similar music. One thing to note that's different though is real player names. Back in the good old days, most people who made footy games for the computers didn't even think or care about licensing and so on, correctly reasoning that nobody would notice. So while the original Italia 90 had bowdlerised names, this does not. Not that it matters really, because let's face it, they all look the same on the pitch. The game itself, it flummoxed me. There's only one button, so I was unable to use my regular strategy of booting the ball up the field and scoring with a close-in header, and had to pass the ball instead. I couldn't figure out to do anything else other than pass the ball if I'm honest. Pretty much every time I tried, the ball would be intercepted or I would be tackled, the opposition would run up the field and they would score. You'll notice that this port does not retain the lousy drawings and strange goal or corner kicks from the original. It's all quite normal. But yeah, needless to say playing this game was not very enjoyable and I wish to move on to something far more interesting. This game was ported to the 8-bits too, meaning that, at last, we can enjoy the most mundane and boring football game of all time on the ZX Spectrum. This is quite the moment. I can't quite believe that this even exists, but it does. It's 128K, so there's even some of the music from the Mega Drive game in AY form. It's all very exciting. So, we get our teams together and start things off. Italy versus South Korea. Let's go. Okay. Well, this game came out in 1991, months after the actual World Cup came to a halt. And, my lord, it's horrific, in a way that's almost disturbing. Whoever coded this really had quite the unique take on football. It all starts from the kickoff, which eschews traditional football rules and instead pits two players from each team against each other to see who gets the ball first. And that's not even the strangest thing. You know what's stranger? This game has no corners, goal kicks, or throw-ins. It's like indoor football of a sort, although more like you're playing in a box as the ball bounces wildly off what you thought were the touchlines. So, yeah. Last I checked, the 1990 World Cup wasn't held indoors, but this is still a unique take. Either that or whoever coded it couldn't actually be asked to program goal kicks, throw-ins or corners into the game. And that's not even the strangest thing. You know what the cherry on top of it all is? You don't even need to kick the ball. Ever. Just grab it and run in a straight line to the goal. You will not be tackled. The goalkeeper will not stop you unless you literally run directly at him. You will score. Every time. It's the granddad of 442 soccer on the PlayStation. It's unbelievable. It is the worst football game I have ever seen. And I've seen a lot of awful ones. I think the game's coder must not have known anything about football at all. They must have never seen the game, ever. And then they had it explained to them one night in a pub after having 10 double scotches and an entire bottle of vodka, and then the following day, with their raging hangover, they were given 10 minutes to code the game. That's the only way I can explain this game at all. Just how? Who the bloody hell made this? Oh my lord. Canvas Software made it. The ultimate. The ones we've covered before, in a story of treachery and tragedy. The folks behind Highlander. The ones who purposefully put out shoddy work, thinking that no one was ever going to notice it. More than that, this is the last game to ever come out under the Canvas name. Weirdly, it came 3 years after their previous title, long after most of the names associated with the studio had departed. Ian Weatherburn, the studio's founder, had passed away. It's some sort of crazy and completely befitting epilogue to that tale. Not so much a game that was developed, almost like a lost transmission that Elite somehow picked up and interpreted. The end result should have probably been hidden away under lock and key, but someone decided to actually release it into the wild for posterity. And the wild is where it has stayed. Utterly obscure. Well, aside from the odd review of the time, including your Sinclair, who somehow gave the game 80%. 80%! For this! My god. Were we, as Spectrum fans, that desperate in 1991? Didn't anyone just think, why won't we just play Match Day 2 instead of this rubbish? Again, I sometimes think that the perceived quality of the magazines of the time is seen through, to say the least, rose-tinted glasses. And well, that was a bit of a weird moment there, wasn't it? The story behind this game and Canvas's names somehow appearing on it, seemingly years after most thought that the company had bit the dust, is probably significantly more mundane in reality. Maybe there's someone out there who knows the answer. But, well, it's an odd way to end this roundabout video. We started out with a lone wanderer in a post-apocalyptic world, imploding baddies with well-aimed punches and kicks to their pressure points, and somehow things just got more and more weird from there. Such is this strange world of gaming, I suppose. Bye for now. I'm surprised it's taken me so long to get to this one. I've often talked about being one of the very few folk in the UK who had a Sega channel in 1997, and a lot of the amazing games it introduced me to right at the end of the Mega Drive's life. If you want a detailed look at this, go check out my Aerobiz Supersonic video. But this game was the pinnacle of that. Unlike the isometric and completely different SNES game, the Mega Drive Shadowrun never came out in Europe aside from on the channel, and it was there in the first month that I had it. And playing it was... hoo boy. It was a game changer. So, a bit of backstory is going to be needed for those who aren't too aware of what Shadowrun is. It's a tabletop RPG set in a dystopian future in the middle of the 21st century. Mega corporations have largely taken control of the planet, computers as we know it have been replaced by a worldwide network known as the Matrix that you jack into. The end of the Mayan long count calendar resulted in the Awakening, which introduced magic and turned a lot of humans into sentient creatures such as orcs, elves, trolls, goblins and dwarves, and the majority of conflicts and disputes are sorted out by Shadowrunners, who are employed by corporations, governments, syndicates and what have you through Mr. Johnsons who operate out on the street. Most things Shadowrun take place in the free city-state of Seattle, a melting pot where all of these entities congregate and then some. This pen and paper classic, originally produced in 1989, created by Jordan Weissman and company at Fassa Corporation, has been the basis for several games. The aforementioned isometric SNES RPG by Beam Software beat this game by about a year. The most obscure of the bunch is a Japanese-only graphic novel for the Mega CD, and the one which created the most ill-feeling was the multiplayer-only FPS that was released on PC and Xbox 360. As we all know by now, when a lot of people love a good RPG or strategy game or something along those lines, they don't much care for it being turned into a shooter. Almost as a response to this, Harebrained Schemes, a new company founded by Weissman, launched a Kickstarter in 2012 to bring Shadowrun video games back as they should be. $1.8 million was raised, and the result of this has been 3 games: the initial Shadowrun Returns, and the hugely praised Shadowrun Dragonfall and Shadowrun Hong Kong. Material has been made to link these games back to the initial 16-bit efforts. Oh, there was also a multiplayer tactical game called Boston Lockdown that also sought crowdfunding, although it didn't make a whole lot of waves. As for the Mega Drive game, well, that was released in 1994 by one of Sega's primary independent studios, Blue Sky, who were primarily known for the hugely successful Jurassic Park game, would later do Vector Man, and would have done the Mega Drive Aladdin if Sega hadn't spread them way too thin. It's often combined with the SNES game in overviews, but they are completely different entities. A different company altogether developed the SNES game, which is also completely different. Now, I may occasionally refer back to the SNES game to see points where the games especially differ, as they are both RPGs, but both games certainly do have merit. Anyway, you play as Joshua. In the beginning, you can choose if he's either a samurai, a decker, or a gator shaman. Shamans are the most unique choice here. They're the only class who can perform magic, which is a pretty large part of the game. However, I normally choose Decker to get a head start on getting into the Matrix. Samurai is the combat-driven class, though really there's not much difference between it and Decker. You can easily be proficient in both combat and hacking, while a Shaman really shouldn't go into the Matrix. The cyber upgrades required were in their all-important essence stat. So Joshua comes to Seattle because his brother Michael was killed in an ambush close by while on a run. He arrives in the Redmond Barrens, an utterly desolate place, with a single piece of info, the name of the motel where he used to stay. And it's automatically a stopgap because the guy in charge isn't giving you Michael's stuff until he gets his back rent. So is there some sort of plot-specific quest you've got to do in order to get a convenient sum of nuyen for the stuff? No. Old Stoker simply tells you to go find a job, and gives you the location of a Johnson. Other than that, you're on your own. And so this is what you do for most of the game. You take runs. In the beginning they're very easy, usually courier or quick escort missions for peanuts, all localised in Redmond until you get enough cash to pay Stoker. Runs, and what you do in them, are the main way that you'll make nuyen in the game, and they're also the main way that you make karma, which you can then use at a motel to improve your attributes. Unlike the SNES Shadowrun where you don't exactly do much running that isn't plot specific, the MD game makes running its core and highly lucrative to boot. We'll get to the Matrix eventually, but in the right system and through downloading the right files, it's possible to make tens of thousands of nuyen on a single run, and that's not just your fee. Late in the game you'll also take on a whole load of corporate ones, sneaking into buildings, eluding security and finding either a package or an employee who wishes to change his career. There are 5 corporations you can run against in the game. From easy to hard, they're Lone Star, Fuchi, Ares, Mitsuhama and Renwaku. The last of these, Renwaku, is a mother. 6 floors, majors, guards, strike teams, hellhounds, cameras, no security terminals until the upper floors. It's a beast, but so very lucrative. You can get things that will help on these ones. Security passes, which are basically essential, a maglock passkey and electronics kit for getting through doors, and if all else fails, well, a handful of frag grenades to blow doors open at the cost of setting off the alarm and likely being killed by a horde of goons unless you've got good combat skills. It's a challenge, but it's worth it. Mega corporations play a pretty big role in Mega Drive Shadowrun. Whereas they were largely in the background of the SNES game, the MD game puts them front and centre in the game's plot. It's pretty clear that they run the entire show, especially as you continue to dig through the game. Which leads you to the place where you will be doing the most digging, and the best thing about the game. Essentially, the game within the game. The Matrix. Again, the Matrix in the SNES game was certainly there, but it was a little simplified. It was kind of like Minesweeper. This Matrix, that's a whole different story. The Matrix is a long battle through often huge, complex networks. In the late game it requires serious skill, serious programs and a serious deck. You can spend hundreds of thousands of nuyen on the deck seriously, upgrading its reflexes, downloading all sorts of different programs for attacking, mask and sensing, all sorts. You will face multiple ice through your journey. A lot of them are pretty simple and can even be bypassed with a single use of the Deception program. Others are less so, in particular the Black Ice. If you lose combat to one of these, you die in real life. And even that is nothing compared to the worst of them all, the Tar Pit. These babies aren't immediately visible, instead they appear when you least expect it the moment a program fails. And then they delete it from your deck. That attack program that you spent so much money upgrading, it's gone. Completely. The Matrix can be punishing if you screw up, and there's no indication that a tar pit's around unless you've analysed the ice beforehand. So it is worth keeping some crappy low-level programs that are guaranteed to fail on the deck, simply to test the waters. Much better to lose a level 1 smoke than a level 9 attack. Believe me, I've been there, and when it happens, well, hopefully the save you have to reload isn't too far back. The Matrix can be tough, but the rewards are exceptional. In the data stores you can download files to your deck that hopefully can be sold at a high price to a fixer in downtown Seattle, which is how you make lots of extra money on Matrix ones. You can also uncover important bits of info for your notebook that adds to the story, as well as help you complete one of the game's major side quests. In corporate systems you can go into slave modules and turn off maglocks or security cameras and what have you. This will greatly help on corporate ones. The same applies for getting all the way to the CPU and crashing the system, or if you're in a spot of bother, get into it and cancelling any alerts that may be blaring out. There's so much good in the Matrix and you'll spend a ton of game time there. It is one of the best secondary additions to any game ever, almost as important as the core game itself. A stroke of genius. And of course you don't necessarily have to do all of this alone. You can hire fellow Shadowrunners for your journey. The best ones can be pretty pricey, but it's often handy to have a good mage if you specialise in decking, or the other way around. The absolute best runner is again found through another very good side quest late in the game. So long as you can keep your whole team alive, you'll have a trio that could last you the entire game. There is one way to game the system, mind. You could hire a runner, trade all their good stuff to Joshua, and then immediately fire them. They'll hate you for it, but it will earn you either some nice stuff or some easy money from selling it. There's also the contacts, which generally are obtained from runners or Johnsons. They cost money, but a couple of them can be absolutely invaluable. It's almost impossible to judge the benefits that come from, say, Sharky's ability to swiftly take you to the Amerindian lands, which is otherwise a complete pain in the arse to get to. That's just one example. And then there's the late game choice of which crime family you want to associate with. Mafia or Yakuza. Either way has its benefit. Actually no, I'm lying. You always want to go Yakuza. Trust me, it's not even a contest. How does all of this fit in with the plot then? The plot itself isn't exactly the greatest in the world or anything. It largely consists of a bunch of fetch quests. You pretty quickly reach the stage where there's 3 separate things that have to be done before you hit endgame. Going up against Renwaku, finding out who killed your brother, and getting in with the elves at the Sinsarak. These largely can be done in whatever order you wish, but it is all pretty fetch questy. Now this isn't a big problem with the game, because it is action RPG style in that all combat takes place in the open world, and it does move at a pretty good pace. And it helps that it's seriously immersive. Even little things like random events being spotted in a crowd, or quick skill tests in the corporate buildings, add to the sheer atmosphere, not to mention the ultra moody music. Shadowrun was essentially the first serious open world experience I ever had, which is why I call it such a game changer. Sure, the SNES game may well have it beat in terms of dialogue or plot. It has an extensive dialogue tree system that this game lacks, not to mention the pedigree of being based on the popular fictional story Never Deal with a Dragon, and indeed actually prominently featuring said dragons, the creatures which are probably associated with this universe more than any other. In case you didn't know, dragons control the world in Shadowrun and have done since the Awakening. In human form they're at the top of the mega corporations, they control countries and even continents. Names such as Dunkelzahn, Lofrir, Aiden and Masaru are legendary in the game's world. SNES Shadowrun does stress the importance of the dragon, whereas they are barely part of the Mega Drive game, at least not until the end when you encounter a feathered serpent, which is basically a lesser dragon. Shadowrun fans might be disappointed by that. However, the gameplay of the Mega Drive game, the karma system and the importance placed on runs in and of themselves is a lot closer to the original tabletop game. In 1997, quite simply, this game blew my mind. I had experienced nothing like it before. I was used to following simple, linear paths, and suddenly this game was giving me freedom to essentially do what I wanted, when I wanted. It allowed me to find information about all these corporations at my own pace, to take the main quest at my own pace. It didn't feed me everything spoon by spoon. It allowed me to discover how corruptible the Lone Star Security were, or the sheer ruthlessness of Renwaku, or the shifty nature of Johnsons like Vigor and Jarl. It presented a harsh world where at any point, especially in places like the Puyallup Barrens or the Salish Shide, you could suddenly be jumped. Not put in a random battle, but quite literally ambushed and shot to bits. Nothing is scarier than the sudden realisation that hellhounds are after you, believe me. This was completely different to everything I'd played before, and ever since then, I yearn for games that give me a similar experience. Back in 1997, Shadowrun for me was quite simply on its own. the greatest game I had ever played. Sure, it got superseded soon enough. When I look at it now, having played the game multiple times, I can see a few cracks here and there. I mean, you can get the best weapon in the game before you even leave Redmond, and you don't even have to spend 1,000 nuyen for it. You can completely screw runners over for easy money, and you can cheat some corporate buildings by simply going in, opening the first safe and going out again until you find the package you need. And I'll also say that the ending just isn't very good, and leave it at that. It's not perfect, but it still gives me a feeling like precious few others, and it laid the groundwork for my love of things like Grand Theft Auto, or Far Cry, or Red Dead, or other open world games. Before all of them, there was Shadowrun on the Mega Drive, and it's still one of my favourites even now. That blast of the logo on the title screen still awakens something in me, all of these years later. There will always be something left of me in a futuristic, dystopian Seattle. Bye for now. Hang on, didn't you do this before? Well yeah, 5 years ago. Being an old video, it's kinda got issues. Bad audio, bad video, and lots of games that went barely covered. I pretty much did the 3 Mega Drive games and left it at that. There's so much more to look at with Golden Axe. Arcade gems, ports galore, spin-off RPGs, and of course a modern game that most everybody disliked. So as I did with Altered Beast a while back, it's time to look at Golden Axe once more and give it the full rundown. The original Golden Axe hails from 1989, a golden year for the side-scrolling beat-em-up with countless stunning examples such as Final Fight, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, River City Ransom. Great stuff. Golden Axe came out early in the year and was made by the same fellas who did Altered Beast, a small team of 5 known as Team Shinobi who were led by Makoto Uchida and were part of Sega's AM1 arcade division. The game was inspired in particular by Uchida's love of action movies and Western-style fantasy. Conan the Barbarian is obviously a direct influence, but he was also a big fan of Lord of the Rings. This was Uchida's second Sega game after Altered Beast, and you can see the Western influences written large in that game too. Uchida believed that an arcade game should try to have as much substance as the big RPGs of the time, the Dragon Quests and what have you, and it is even said that at one point Golden Axe was initially going to be an RPG, although this was quickly shut down by the higher-ups. The other big influence on the game was, of course, Double Dragon, the 1987 game that had kicked off the golden age of beat-em-ups in the arcade. Sega wanted a Double Dragon style game without just flat out ripping off Double Dragon, and the fantasy setting of Golden Axe was ideal for it. The biggest puzzle of development for the game would be the series' Golden Rule. Everyone must use a weapon. No one fights with their fists in Golden Axe. This creates a different challenge in terms of designing a beat-em-up where weapons are permanent instead of temporary. You don't want weapons to have too big a range, otherwise they'll be overpowered and you'll lose the balance, but if you make it too small and put it in the hands of a big sprite, well, it might look a bit silly. The solution? Decrease the size of the sprites. The weapons are the reason why Golden Axe's characters are significantly smaller than, say, Final Fights. This is also true of games such as TMNT and Capcom's Dynasty Wars. Said games, including Golden Axe, also make use of big boss characters to intensify the game and make it feel like more of a challenge. All that aside, the game came out on time and was a significant arcade hit. It's one of the first games I remember playing and loving in an arcade. Playing it today, it's still easy to see why, as it's a very strong beat-em-up indeed. The thing that strikes me about Golden Axe is that it's a more considered beat-em-up than a lot of others, slower paced and even somewhat strategic, as opposed to bashing buttons and going in all guns blazing. Uchida wanted the fights to feel like actual clashes. Enemies move slowly and carefully, and you always have to try and get into that sweet spot, not too close in but not far away. Uchida has likened this to hitting a baseball with a bat. Enemies occasionally rush in, or they'll try and flank you, and you end up doing a fair bit of lateral moving in order to get in position. It may have less sprites on screen than something like Final Fight does, but Golden Axe does a lot with what it has. Our 3 heroes, Axe Battler, Tyrus Flare, and Julius Thunderhead, 3 fighters who have suffered personally at the hands of the evil Death Adder and his attempts to destroy the Kingdom of Uria, all feel notably different as well. There's the typical choice between all-rounder speed and strength, of course, but magic is the big factor. Gilius lacks any powerful magic but makes up for it with melee combat skills, whereas Tyrus is the opposite with spells that can one-shot virtually every normal enemy in the game. You get magic potions and food intermittently by kicking the arse of little thieves, and you decide when to use this magic. Do you concentrate on using low-powered spells often, or save up potions for a big spell against a boss? Normally I do the latter, as even Tyrus, my speciality, is pretty nifty when it comes to combat. You get plenty of moves, dash attacks, backslashes, and the almighty downward stab. The best way to deal with most any enemy, if you can, is to knock them down, then run and jump for the downward stab. It's tricky to time, but if you get them, it does a ton of damage. The really striking parts of Golden Axe though, it's the little things. The Bizarrians that you use in combat in many ways replace the function of traditional weapons, powerful attacks that you get to use for a short time until you're inevitably knocked off of them. The fireball throwing dragon is indeed a game breaker, so it makes sense that you only get it once for a quite limited amount of time. I love how cohesive the game is. All of the stages are memorable, from the village on the back of a turtle to flying on the back of a great eagle, and they all fit into each other, almost as if the game could be one massive stage if it wanted to be. There's other great touches. The skeletons don't just look like Ray Harryhausen's work, they move like it too. The blood-curdling screams sampled from First Blood, the fact that dead enemies stay on the screen instead of fading out, and the chicken leg making a second appearance in a Sega game after featuring an altered beast. Golden Axe does a great job of emulating the works that it's influenced by, the Conans, Red Sonjas, Flesh and Bloods and all that good stuff. It's arguably the best Conan game to not have an actual Conan license. There's still that great sense of impending doom as you finally reach the inside of Death Adder's castle, and the satisfaction you get when you finally send that axe flying into his body never becomes old. Not to mention the really fun ending where all the characters burst out of the arcade machine. It's not as well remembered today as some of the other beat-em-ups in 1989, but honestly, I'd have to say it's my favourite from that year. A lot of that is down to pure nostalgia and bias, but I still find the arcade game a ton of fun, just as much as it was for a lot of people back in the day. Indeed, so many people had fun with it that a port to Sega's new 16-bit console was inevitable. This was an absolute no-brainer really. Golden Axe found its way onto the Mega Drive pretty quickly, being released right before Christmas 1989 in Japan and the US, and winter 1990 in Europe, although to be fair that was because the MD didn't come out until 1990 over here. In doing this, it managed to have a reasonably accurate home version of the game quite a ways before a lot of its contemporaries like Final Fight and TMNT, and naturally it came with 2 player options to boot. Just how good is this port then? It's pretty strong indeed. It's been a while since we've seen a system provide such a strong looking port of an arcade game, perhaps not since the early days of the NES and Donkey Kong and what have you, so the consoles are getting closer. Of course the arcades would immediately pull away again, but hey ho. The Mega Drive Golden Axe port is certainly there graphically. It really doesn't lose out by much at all in a side-by-side comparison to the arcade. As far as 16-bit games go, yeah, it's a show of strength. Even the complex magical effects aren't that far off in this version. I still get a pretty big kick out of this port. It's another Mega Drive game I've played a hell of a lot, although like a lot of others I almost never played it on an original cart and instead played it on Mega Games 2, which was released in 1993. Seriously, the 1-2-3 punch of Liss, Revenge of Shinobi and Streets of Rage on one cart might make this the best compilation ever. I've guided these characters, mostly Tyrus I have to say, to victory many a time, and it's always fun because it's just difficult enough to never quite make it a sure thing. Indeed, I've probably played this more than the original arcade game, as good as that is. One thing that's good about the port is that it does feature some extras to keep the motor running that little bit longer. There is of course the duel mode, a 12-round battle of endurance on the ramparts between yourself and all of the game's enemies except for Death Adder, from the Henningers right up to the Golden General Bitters. Each battle has a strict timer, although the only thing this affects is whether the battle scores or not. As with the arcade game, you get a strength meter at the end of each playthrough, which doubles as a high score table. There's the beginner mode, which most of you have probably never seen. It's just the first 3 stages of the game, and then you fight the almighty Death Adder Jr. at the end of the 3rd. The original game itself features an extra stage, which in an amusing twist is the easiest stage of the entire game for reasons which will become clear, and a final battle with Death Brinner, which is easily the hardest part of the game. He's accompanied by 2 immortal skeletons, has an attack which is very hard to avoid, and if he hits you he'll follow up with magic that will likely kill you in one shot. Once again, it is very satisfying to beat this man, especially when you do it with just 2 bars of energy left. However, the port isn't without fault, mainly the enemies. They're a lot easier to deal with. They always have a set way of following you, and things that they will most always do. If they're far enough away and they can dash, they'll always charge you, and they come to you in the same way no matter what. At various points in the game, these 2 things can be manipulated to easily make enemies fall to their doom, especially in the aforementioned last stage, which is easy despite featuring the toughest mobs in the game. All the enemies do this, which can make them feel samely. This doesn't mean though that things like skeletons won't cause you trouble. Sheer speed and variety makes them easily the toughest enemies of the game. The bitters, on the other hand, which were probably the hardest in the arcade game, pretty easy. While you can't really dash them due to their sword attack most of the time, it's easy to manipulate them into being hit constantly. And as always, the tackle, 1, downward stab combo is the key to a quick victory. It's certainly key to defeating Deathbringer, as a few of them will bring him down to size in no time. That said, it's still an excellent port in many ways. I'd be foolish to say that I didn't like it because I've played through it so many damn times and I know it inside out. It's hard to think of another port from the arcade that was more impressive than Golden Axe was at the time of its release. Like Altered Beast before it was still a relatively new arcade game, one with very few cigarette burns on it, so to speak. And here it is in the home, virtually intact. Not totally arcade perfect, of course, but close enough so that casual people who weren't looking for differences would barely notice. In many ways, it's 16-bit gaming in a nutshell, and even when the cracks do show, it's still a lot of fun. But of course, the Mega Drive version is far from the only one. We have lots of ports to get through, especially when we get to Computerland. First up, there's the obligatory 8-bit version for the Master System. As far as these things go, it's okay. Certainly a lot better than Altered Beast on the Master System, that's for sure. The graphics are certainly cut down a fair bit, but it's not too bad for 8 bits, and all the enemies are still here. There are some cuts, of course. You don't get any of the extra stuff that appeared in the Mega Drive version, so there's no Deathbringer or anything like that. Biggest of all though is that 2 characters are cut. There's no Tyrus or Gilius, just Axe Battler, who is renamed Tariq for this version. You can choose between the 3 different magics, mind you. Axe's usual Earth, Tyrus's Fire, and Gilius's Lightning. Of the Master System Sega arcade port sits somewhere in the middle, not on the level of Outrun or Space Harrier, but not bad either. And while we're still on Sega, it should be noted that Golden Axe appeared on the Mega CD 5-in-1 Sega Classics pack. It's basically the Mega Drive version with the addition of Redbook music from the arcade, a couple of very weak voice samples, and unfortunately it can only be played in single player. The only other console version of the game came out for the PC Engine CD and was developed by Telenet. As with other games such as Space Harrier, Shinobi and the like, it made sense for Sega to release games on NEC's machine in Japan only, where the PC Engine was the clear number 2 behind Nintendo. Being a CD game, you get the usual anime cutscenes for each character, as well as more Redbook music, this time an arranged soundtrack, which is pretty good. Alas, it's the only thing that's good here. It's hard to say what happened with this one. The port is utterly botched. It moves so choppy, the graphics make the Master Systems look great, the enemy placement is all over the shop, controls unresponsive, and the sound effects, they're a joke. It even commits a cardinal beat-em-up sin of putting you all the way back to the start of a stage when you use a continue. It's an appalling game that's often regarded as one of the very worst PC Engine titles, and far below Telenet's usual standards. Shambolic. Okay, right, off to the computers. Lots of UK microports here, most of which was published by Virgin and developed by Probe. First off, I really like the cover art they used on these ports. A very nice little fantasy painting, that's what I usually think of when it comes to the game's art. Other than that, all the usual suspects are represented here, and we'll start off with the Amiga. And hey, it's good. Sure, the movement's obviously a bit slower, and we don't have as many frames in the animation, but it's very recognisably Golden Axe. There's not much left out at all, and the controls actually work fine with a single button. The music on this version is really good too. The only trouble with it is that it's very easy. The speed at which you swing the sword does make it rather straightforward to stun lock most every enemy in the game, making it a bit of a breeze. Still a fine conversion though. The Atari ST version is mostly the same. There's a few changes to the HUD, different music, and the scrolling's a bit choppier of course, but it's still a very serviceable game of Golden Axe. That's the big micros. How about the little ones? The C64 version starts off great, an awesome arrangement by Jerome Tell for the music. But sadly it's all downhill from there. This is just really dull. You only fight one enemy at a time, and for most of a stage it's the exact same enemy. Again, it's very easy. Just stand in place and swing your sword at the enemy moving dumbly forward at you. Graphically it's fine, but game-wise, dull. And there's lots missing too, including, ridiculously, the final stage of the game. Nope, you don't even get to fight Death Adder in this one. This is a very slow and very boring game, and you'd really have to be dedicated to grind it out all the way to the end, and then to not even get the proper bloody ending. It's disappointing because you think that the C64 should have been capable of a lot more here, especially when you compare it to the Spectrum and Amstrad versions. Considering the power of these two systems, the Spectrum 128K and Amstrad CPC versions do deliver. Sure, it's not exactly nice looking, but it's fine for these two. And we've got a nice AY rendition of the Jerome Tell arrangement. Game-wise, they also differ from the other ports we've seen by being frankly hard as nails. This is a mean game of Golden Axe where your characters can die very quickly and the mobs are very much intact. Here you can happily fight with 3 or even 4 enemies at once, no problem. And they're both 2-player games as well. They're not great by any means, but they're okay. If one of these was all you had, then you'd be happy enough with Golden Axe on here. Oh, and guess what? Unlike the C64 version, you can beat Death Adder here. And so the Alan Sugar systems give Commodore an outright spanking when it comes to Golden Axe. There is one more port to look at, mind you. PC-DOS, one we don't always see here at Kim Towers, and that sometimes produces rather shocking results. Off the bat, the PC version is different because it's actually a port of the Mega Drive version, complete with the dual, beginner mode, and the extra stage against Deathbringer. And, well, it's easily the strongest computer port of Golden Axe. It might be a little choppy still, but the VGA graphics are fantastic, and again, everything is here. Indeed, there's more than all the other computer ports that just follow the arcade version. It's even better when played with a joystick, of course, but I didn't do too badly even with the numpad. A very fine port indeed, this one. There is one other thing too. If you go into the games folder, you'll find all the models. And if you rename any model to, say, Dwarf, the name for Julius Thunderhead, you can play as them. You can play as literally anyone in the game, from Death Adder to a frickin' villager. It's obviously kind of buggy, but still amusing to do. Anyway, PC folk loved this game back in the day, and it's easy to see why, as I would say it's probably one of the first PC ports to really do the arcade game justice. PC Format even named it one of the best 50 PC games ever. That was back in 1991, mind you. In any case, it's a great bit of work, and the best computer Golden Axe port. Anyway, that's the original, all ports covered. Not bad this time out actually. Aside from the lousy PC Engine and C64 games, they're a pretty good little bunch. Golden Axe as a game was definitely served well by its arcade ports. Of course, it would be the only game in the series to get such a treatment. Most every other title in the franchise appeared on just one platform only. But we certainly have a long way to go still. Now, the subject of Golden Axe sequel is a very mixed bag depending on what game you're talking about. First up in the timeline, however, is the Mega Drive sequel, Golden Axe 2, released in late 1991. Another big guy with a big devil-horned helmet has taken control of the Golden Axe. His name is Dark Gould, and once again it's up to our 3 heroes to put a stop to his silly nonsense before he destroys the kingdom. It's worth noting immediately that Golden Axe 2 is actually the only other game in the franchise to feature the original 3 heroes. It gets a little bit sketchier from here on out. For now though, we're still riding with Axe, Tyrus and Gilius. In the first video I was pretty harsh towards this game, calling it little more than a retread of the original. I still don't think it's that good, but I am going to be less harsh. Yes, Golden Axe 2 is very close to the original game. In many ways it feels like an old version of DLC. There aren't all that many enemies in Golden Axe 2 that could be considered new. A lot of them are reskins. Minotauros, for example, are just the same as Bad Brothers, and Hell Lizards are the same as Amazons. The main new enemy is the Magician, which replaces the Thief. They actually have an offensive attack, although it is of course terrible because at the end of the day these guys are meant to dispense spellbooks. There are little improvements to the play here and there. Something about Golden Axe 2 is that little bit smoother and cleaner than the original, with the hit detection cleaned up a bit. I noticed that you can control a downward stab now, which makes it a bit easier to hit. The enemy AI is largely still the same, you can still manipulate them to walk off ledges. However, Death Armors, who replace Bitters, are much harder here, especially because they evade dashes. The biggest technical improvement is to magic. Now you can hold the A button down and choose what level of spell you cast, meaning you don't have to burn all your spellbooks on a single big shot anymore. That's good. Still, yeah, it's very similar to the original technically. Business has certainly picked up graphically though, the game's art is very good indeed. As memorable as the original? Possibly not, but quality-wise, it's a keeper. The colours just pop that much more. The soundtrack is also fantastic just about all the way through, especially the first level theme, which is my favourite Golden Axe song of the whole series. Golden Axe 2 in and of itself isn't a bad game. It is a bit annoying in that there's not much of a jump between the original and number 2. It's not a Streets of Rage type dealie. But yeah, it's okay, particularly if you like Golden Axe. If you don't, then it's probably not going to change your mind. While we're on console still, there is something else to cover before the next big game, the two 8-bit spin-offs. First up there's Golden Axe Warrior for the Master System, which features another hero going up against the giant Death Adder, this time on his own. To do so he must find the 9 crystals of the royal family of Firewood in various dungeons before finding the Golden Axe and beating Death Adder himself. As you can see, it's a lot like Legend of Zelda, and I do mean a frickin' lot. Which doesn't mean it's bad, it's actually a very good Zelda clone, and even if there is nothing original whatsoever about it, it's still a good game, albeit one that will set you back a pretty penny. The one I have more experience with is Axe Battler: A Legend of Golden Axe, also from 1991 and for the Game Gear. I used to play this a lot back in the day, on holiday, in hospital once, lots of memories. It is also a bit of a Zelda clone. This time around it's more like Zelda 2, seeing as you have a top-down overworld, but then battles and dungeons are played out side-scrolling platform style. You learn various new moves for your character along the way and yeah, that's it. It's a very linear, short and quite easy game. Disappointingly, it doesn't even have a proper ending boss battle or anything like that. Axe merely cuts down the darkness at the end of the final dungeon in a text cutscene. Still, memories are good and generally it's alright. I always get the feeling with both this and Golden Axe Warrior, however, that they started out as something else. The Axe Battler character is completely different, as are a lot of the enemies. They don't feel much like Golden Axe, although they are not bad games. In any case, the series finally does have its own RPG now, so hooray for that. But now we're going back to business. For most people, a proper Golden Axe sequel is its arcade return, 1992's Golden Axe: The Revenge of Death Adder. The hack and slasher comes back in 32 glorious bits, and they're all on show. This game was pretty damn awesome to see in the flesh, with tons of sprites, big effects, 4-player action. Indeed, 4, there's a new character. In fact, only Gilius remains from the original trio, riding on the back of a giant named Goa. Stern Blade is the Axe Battler alike, and then there's 2 pretty new ones. Dora, a female centaur, and Little Trix, a young kid who moves pretty fast, kinda like Golden Axe's version of Skate from Streets of Rage 2. One thing remains the same though, Death Adder's about, and he's up to no good. This game for many people is the top Golden Axe game. It's easy to see why. Look at it, it's clearly very freaking good. The battles and the animations are so clean and spectacular, the effects of the magic particularly memorable, especially as you see some poor Grunt's face melt off due to being cleansed with fire. Every character serves a purpose, from a big giant who can crush most enemies and do lots of crowd control, to Little Trix who can use his magic to heal himself or his friends. The jump from the original to this is akin to Streets of Rage 1 to 2, if not even greater. Magic is improved again. While you don't get to choose a level of magic, you can pick up as many potions as you want. Being an arcade game, this one is pretty hard. If I had to say one thing, is that it does lose a couple of the things that made Golden Axe more unique. It's a much faster game and feels that little bit more like a traditional beat-em-up, as opposed to the slow hacking action of Golden Axe. This isn't really a complaint though, because Revenge of Death Adder is still damn good at that. The multiple paths also help a lot, there's so much to see here. It's bloody great, and the final battle against Death Adder is one of the most dramatic you'll find in an arcade beat-em-up. As far as weapon-based beat-em-ups go, and especially as a 4-player beat-em-up experience, it's right up there. Only the Dungeons & Dragons games would give this stiff competition. It's a true classic. And alas, one that never made its way home. I guess that being released in 1992 put it in a bit of an awkward position. This was a 32-bit game, and there's no way that the Mega Drive or Mega CD could have done it justice. One really wishes it had made its way to the Saturn or even the 32X, but by that time, well, there was another Golden Axe game out, which we'll be talking about in a bit. It surprises me to this day that, as popular as it is, Revenge of Death Adder has never had a re-release of any kind. Although knowing Sega, there could be a myriad of reasons for that, most probably lost source code. In any case, it's back home for another bit of axe in action. In 1993, Sega started making noise about the latest Golden Axe game. Indeed, it got previewed a fair bit in Western magazines with lots of screenshots and the like. However, Golden Axe 3 wouldn't come out over here. For whatever reason, Sega decided against releasing it in the West. The only way to play it back in the day was either importing it or playing it on the Sega channel, where it did make a few appearances. If you imported it, yeah, you might have got burnt just a little. I was far too kind to this game when I did it first time around, I have to say. Golden Axe 3 once again features another giant guy with an axe who takes over, and you already know the score. This time none of the original cast is playable. It seems as though Julius has assembled this team, but they're all different. Kane Grinder and Sarah Byrne take the place of Axe and Tyrus respectively. We have the giant Proud Cragger, and a fast Panther Man, Kronos Evil Late. Yes, Panther Man, not a lizard. The bad guy's name this time around is Damned Hellstrike, which is at the very least somewhat metal, an improvement over Dark Gould in any case. Golden Axe 3 at the very least does not feel the same as the first two games. Clearly it's running on something different as you can't do the old tricks. Unfortunately, it's also quite bland, and the controls seem to have suffered, especially when compared to the ultra-tight Golden Axe 2. You do get a few more variations in moves, a simpler diving slash for example, but generally it's pedestrian action. Some of the enemy designs aren't bad, although there's not a whole lot of them. It feels kinda repetitive a lot of the time because of this. The worst thing about this game though? Geez, it's just the way it looks. One of the most uninspiring beat-em-ups of them all. Golden Axe as a series is known for excellent graphics and memorable settings, and this has none of those. It's featureless. One level is literally nothing but sand dunes. Another has an utterly barren sky. The last level is a rampart. There's no creativity here, it feels like. I would almost say that the levels feel like placeholders for something better looks-wise, but the something better just never materialised. Not a good showing at all. Golden Axe 3 in many ways just feels like a beta. There's that much of a lack of polish about it to make it feel like it needed a few months more in the shed. It's a shame to see. There's the odd moment where things do work. I like the battles you have with Eve, for example, or even the stage that takes place on the back of an eagle flying to the castle, but it's not enough. And it came out just a few weeks after Revenge of Death Adder hit the arcades to boot. The series had that shorter period of prominence again, and then this comes out and disappoints utterly to the point where you really don't know where the series is at. Suddenly it feels like Golden Axe is winding down. And, well, that largely proved to be true. Another Golden Axe game came out in 1994, Golden Axe The Duel, and it changed things up totally, giving us a fighting game instead of a beat-em-up. Not a surprise, seeing as fighting games were obviously in, and beat-em-ups were fading out a little at this stage. We get another cast of characters, with a couple such as Kane Blade, Milan Flare and Julius Rockhead, who are related to other similar heroes, but the only returning character is Death Adder himself, who is playable to boot. How is it, Lynn? Well, it's alright, basically. The graphics do look pretty decent and colourful, especially in the arcade version. The trouble is, however, that the game doesn't really do much to stick out from all the other fighting games that were around at the time. If you compare this to something directly rivaling it, like a Samurai Showdown 2 for instance, yeah, that's not going to go well. Nor is it going to be competing with the Street Fighters or anything like that. It's not as disastrous a game as Double Dragon 5, The Shadow Falls, far from it, but it's still very much mid-table, somewhere anonymous in the peloton. The game got ported to the Sega Saturn and looked fine there too due to that system's great 2D, but it didn't do too much business there either. And so, well, Golden Axe's time had largely passed. I don't think there were all that many attempts to bring it back in the years between this and the next time we saw it. There's the odd one here and there, but nothing like the attempts to bring back Streets of Rage. Just the occasional cameo, or a storyline in something like Sonic the Comic where the adventures of the original trio were featured for years. Plans for a TV series based on it were made, I believe, but it never materialised. And in the end, the next time we saw the axe was in 2003, when the original would be remade as part of the Sega Ages 2500 series. Right, there's no need to mix words here. This is the absolute worst Golden Axe game, full stop. Worse than any port of the original you care to mention, even the PC Engine one. The one possible thing to shout about here is a rearranged soundtrack. Other than that, it speaks for itself. This may be a budget title, but it's still a complete disaster. Torturous to play, and the graphics are abysmal. Forget about PS1, this is what I would expect a 3D Golden Axe to look like on the 3DO. The Sega Ages 2500 series was a variable collection of redone Sega classics, some of which really did work, but it's almost universally agreed that Golden Axe is the absolute worst of it. Inexplicably, this putrid mess was re-released in the West as part of the Sega Classics collection, just so that people in the USA and Europe could hate it too. What a calamity, and one wishes that no one had bothered. And so finally we get to 2008's Golden Axe Beast Rider, an attempt by Sega and developers Secret Level to revive the franchise on the Xbox 360 and PS3 in full 3D beat-em-up form. This was a game I didn't cover last time as I'd never played it, but now I can finally end a look at Golden Axe properly. I broke the bank and spent all of a $5 just so I could have a copy and bring it to you directly. The game features Tyrus Flare as the main character, while Julius and Tariq, the real name of Axe Battler now as it turns out, take non-playable roles. And of course Death Adder is the main villain. He so happens to be voiced by the late Roger Avery, aka Uncle Phil of Fresh Prince fame. I really hope that's not the coolest thing about this game. Alas, yeah, it basically is. Beast Rider is not a very good game, and was rightly crucified when it came out. To see why, you have to look at the successful beat-em-up or hack-and-slash games from around that time, the likes of Ninja Gaiden 2, which came out the same year, or Bayonetta that came the year after, alongside Batman Arkham Asylum. Against those, Beast Rider is a hopeless effort that feels years behind the times. The core gameplay is kind of a Simon Says type deal. If an enemy's attack is blue, block. If it's orange, evade. And that's it really, so long as said defense actually works, which half the time it doesn't because Tyrus is utterly ungainly as a character. And the graphics are they're forgettable, to put it mildly. It's what Golden Axe 3 would have looked like in 3D. A lot of the game is spent riding around on beasts, as you would expect from the title. Unfortunately, this part of the game is even worse. They do not feel nice at all to ride around on, let alone attack with. The worst thing might be trying to hit gnomes, which is faithfully recreated in 3D and about 1,000 times more annoying than it previously was. In the end though, the biggest sin this game commits is sheer blandness, a game so far behind the times it was dead on arrival as soon as it hit the stores. It's funny really, Uchida's first big project, Altered Beast, would suffer a similar fate with its final game on the PS2. That was bad, but this is just dull. Perhaps only one thing is worse than ending on sheer disappointment, and that's fading out into total mediocrity. And so that's basically it for Golden Axe. Short of cameos here and there, Beast Rider was the last entry in the series, and I really wouldn't hold my breath for another. Julius Thunderhead is at least represented often in Sega games. He appeared in both Sega Superstars Tennis and the excellent Sonic All-Stars Racing Transformed, which features a stage inspired by Golden Axe. Axe Battler and Tyrus Flare, meanwhile, seem to be a ways away. But while we may never see Golden Axe in anything other than cameos and retro re-releases from this point on, it still made a lot out of its time in the spotlight. Even if that's just an influential beat-em-up which still holds some worth today, and one of the greatest games never to leave the arcade, it's still something to shout about. Bye for now. So let's talk about a game. What game though? Picking a game can be hard sometimes. It's surprisingly difficult to get hyped up about, I don't know, Gunstar Heroes. Yeah, it's great. That's obvious, clearly. But the mood's just not there. In the words of George Harrison, it's been done. So if you're in a bit of a rut, as I am, you go to the comfort zone. Sod the classics, I want to talk about something mundane. I want to review World Cup Italia 90. Why this game specifically will become clear. You might already be wondering if there's something special about it, and I'll burst your bubble by straight away saying that no, there isn't. This game is not worthy of a big documentary style video that goes into the making of the whole thing. That's about all there is to say with regards to the game's creation. The only interesting behind the scenes thing is that Sega published the game jointly with Virgin Mastertronic, presumably because they both had the license or got together to get the license for a World Cup game. And that's not very interesting, is it? So it's a traditional review. We can move straight on to the game itself. World Cup Italia 90 is, well, it's shit. But shit in a very specific way. It's a game that's probably familiar to most everyone who owned a Mega Drive. Even if you didn't have the cart itself, which did sell, chances are you probably had it or saw it on the Mega Games 1 cartridge, which loads of people had. The game shared space with Columns and Super Hanon, and the cart was part of MD bundles from around about 1993. If you're American, you know said compilation as Triple Score 3-in-1, and you know this game as World Championship Soccer. The game's license only applied to Europe. So, how is it shit? It seems obvious, really. I mean, all you have to do is look. World Cup Italia 90 is the sort of game that, at the time, could make some people think, this is the 16-bit revolution that everyone's talking about? Well, thanks, but I'm gonna stick with my Spectrum. It's a top-down footy game, a viewpoint familiar to most, and I'm guessing inspired by Tekken World Cup and what have you. And it's, well, quite ugly looking. Every player is identical aside from the colour of shirt that they wear, right down to having the same perfectly round haircut. If they ever do a bicycle kick, you will see that they have no face. The goalie is the only exception, and he looks even worse, a true mishmash of shapes. When he's got the ball in his hands, these weird fins stick out of him. I'm not sure if the goalie's either got a really long deerstalker hat on, or if he's actually being played by Goofy. In short, it's an ugly game. The presentation is haphazard beyond belief, and nothing truly works about it. There's even a classic ugly radar that serves no purpose because, like most radars in football games, you will never ever look at it because you have no reason to look at it. The sound effect of a ball being kicked is akin to that of a curry fart. Even the music, a bouncy calypso-esque soundtrack which most people would agree is the best part of the game, is ruined, because every time the ball goes out of play, the music stops and restarts from the beginning. Actually, it's worse than that. When the ball goes out of play, the game cuts to a black screen and the music hangs in a way that, for a split second, always makes you think that the game's crashed, before restarting. As a consequence of this, if you play the game for any length of time, then this snippet of music will be in your head for the rest of your life. And speaking of ugly, there's the big pictures of goal kicks, corners, and, of course, the celebration after a goal. Isn't that just a marvel? If I ever make millions of pounds, then I'm going to get this blown up, framed, and stuck on a wall, as a monument to good taste. Still, nothing in World Cup Italia 90 is uglier than the football itself. This is a game where you do nothing but hoof the ball. You hoof the ball endlessly, aiming for it to get into the box, where hopefully your striker's in position to head the ball into the back of the net. That's the secret to victory. You hammer B and get the ball upfield through endless diagonal long balls, and then once you're in and around the box, you hit A for the header. You won't score every time, but you'll score a fair bit, more than enough to win. If your strikers haven't developed a major case of CTE by the time the group stages are over, then you're not doing it right. The C button for a ground pass might as well not exist. Roughly around 60% of your goals will probably be scored in this fashion, and no, I didn't pull that number out of my arse. I counted the goals I scored over the course of a tournament and got the percentages for both head and feet. That's how dedicated I am. If you're playing a shit team, you may get the odd chance to run at the opposition, but most of the time you're just swarmed by the defence if you try. So get hoofing and heading, and you'll win. This is the sort of football that the marketing bod at Nike who coined the phrase Yoga Bonito doesn't want to admit actually exists. It's a simulation of how Greece won the European Championships in 2004. It's a football that us English folk are intimately familiar with, probably because it's what our national team have brought to every major tournament for the past 20 years. It's football that makes our newest international manager, Sam Allardyce, get a right stonker in his pants. So yes, a shit game that looks like shit, presents itself like shit, is shittily ultra sluggish and unresponsive, another reason to hoof the ball, and plays utterly shit football. It's shit. But it is sort of special because it's so utterly familiar. It's even somewhat endearing and hits a certain nostalgia bone. Perhaps it's something that only the odd person will get. Maybe you have to support a team from your country's lower divisions. Or you just have to be bored. World Cup Italia 90 is the sort of game that you play when you can think of virtually nothing else to do. A default choice. The people behind Mega Games 1 knew this utterly. That's why Italia 90's right there in the middle, the default choice on the menu, with one of its themes playing. You actually have to make an effort if you want to play Columns or Super Hanon. When you play Italia 90, you want something quick, cheap and dirty. And of course you want to win, which you will because the game is so ridiculously easy. Even if you really lean into your boredom and go on to win the tournament, it'll only take a little over an hour. And of course you would never expect anything more at the end than a single screen summing up your results, complete with another awfully low quality picture before being kicked back to the title screen. By which point, hopefully, you've thought of something more constructive to do with your day. It's comically mindless, you'll get a giggle from the odd cock-up here and there, whether by you or the computer, and chances are pretty good that you'll win. And those cock-ups are indeed quite funny. Because hey, even if you're winning most games by 5 goals or more, that doesn't mean you're playing beautiful football. It's ugly football, and the goals are gloriously ugly too. You score thanks to the goalie screwing up, or watching as your limp shot from the area goes in when the keeper just dives at nothing. Your own goalie is manually controlled, which provides plenty of opportunities to screw up big time on the rare occasion when the opponent is in your box. My favourite though, and the defining moment for me, is when you have a goal kick, as I do here in my Quera final against West Germany. Suddenly the B button you've been using to hoof the ball all game magically becomes a concede a goal button, where you pass straight to the other team's striker who sticks it straight into your gaping net. Hilarious. I mean, it didn't matter. I was already 4-0 up. So, to summarise briefly, yes, this is a rubbish game, and certainly not one that I would recommend to anybody, unless, as previously mentioned, you're Sam Allardyce, who's probably already using this game as a tactics tool for the 2018 World Cup. I even put it in my 20 worst Mega Drive games list ages ago, which in retrospect was a bit unfair. There are plenty worse footy games than this on the Mega Drive after all. But it was also unfair because, well, can I honestly justify all the hours that I've actually put into the game? It's not like I truly enjoyed it at any point, from 1992 all the way up to now. And yet, I always come back to it. Why? Well, that's the eternal question. Similar to Why Do People Eat Pot Noodles? Or Rustler's Quarter Pounders? Or Chicago Town Deep Dish Pizzas? I'm sure plenty of us would love to always grind up some quality meat, fry some bacon bits, get some nice pickles, toast the bun and grill a beautiful patty up to medium rare every time. But we don't always want that. And not just because it's expensive or inconvenient or time consuming. In a place you don't want to talk about at parties, you want that Rustler's burger. And you eat that microwaved Rustler's burger with the sloppy bun, lukewarm meat disc, desultory burger sauce and cheese flavoured singlet. And if, while doing that, you were playing World Cup Italia 90 at the same time, well, that would be a thoroughly appropriate choice of game, my friend. It's time. A proper set of videos covering Sega's premier contribution to the world of RPGs, that being Phantasy Star. A game and series that did things a little differently from the other big names in the genre, with the final result being 4 games that, for the most part, come together as a whole saga spanning thousands of years in a science fiction themed universe. Not that it's the sort of series where you have to play them in order so that you can enjoy them fully. There's people who started with the first game that we're covering today, when it was positioned as the most advanced game you could get on consoles at the time. Similarly, there are people who started with 2 because it was the first RPG available on a 16-bit machine, some started with 4 because it was so utterly revered, and, well, there are probably some unfortunate folk who started with the third game, which is not the ideal way to start playing Phantasy Star. In any case, each of the 4 main Phantasy Star games are worthy of a video on their own, and naturally we're going to kick off with the first game, released in 1987 for the Master System. While Phantasy Star does primarily exist simply because Sega wanted an RPG of their own that could compete with the runaway success of games like Dragon Quest on the Famicom, it would be a great series in its own right over 2 generations of machines, still one of Sega's most beloved ones to this day. It unquestionably deserves a proper treatment, so let's get on with it, and go back to in and around the start of 1987. The concept of the JRPG, as we would call it in the West, was still kind of new in the start of 1987. Primarily there was one series that towered over everything, that being Dragon Quest. The taste for RPGs in general had developed a couple of years previously, when a small scene that was largely based around rougher games for platforms like the PC-88 was thrust open by the success of 1984's The Black Onyx, a strange beast considering that the game barely made it outside of Japan, but was made by the Hawaii-based Bulletproof Software, led by Dutch video game designer Henk Rogers. Rogers went all out promoting the game, essentially touring around the Japanese gaming press and teaching them how to play this very much D&D inspired game, showing them how to create parties and what have you, and the result of his efforts was a big hit that introduced RPGs to the majority of Japanese game players. From the success of Black Onyx came an appetite for the big American games that Rogers himself was inspired by, those being Wizardry and Ultima, while a more action-led RPG scene developed around early successors like Hyderlide and Dragon Slayer, not to mention the release of Nintendo's Legend of Zelda in 1986. Enix's first Dragon Quest title was released in May of '86, making its own path by aiming straight for the Nintendo Famicom rather than the computers that these other games had released on, and it ended up selling around 1 million copies in 6 months. By the time that the sequel came out just 6 months later, in January of 1987, a lot of other companies wanted a piece of the action, and the thing that's known as the JRPG was basically born. Naturally, it was at this time when the bosses at Sega sent out a message to the R&D2 division looking for RPG ideas. The role of lead planner for Sega's RPG project was given to Kotaro Hayashida, also known as Asale. Hayashida had recently created a pretty big hit for Sega that was also made because they'd wanted an equivalent to what the opposition had, that being 1986's Alex Kidd in Miracle World, and a top quality RPG was seen as one of the best ways for Sega to try and get more of a foothold in the Japanese market, where the Mark III, or Master System, was well behind the Famicom. A lot of the other members of the Phantasy Star team were people who Hayashida had worked with previously, such as character designer Rieko Kodama, aka Phoenix Ri, who had worked with Hayashida not just on Alex Kidd, but also on arcade games such as Ninja Princess. Yuji Mu Naka was heading up the programming, while other members of the team included Miki Morimoto, Kazuyuki Shibata, Toru Yoshida, Naoto Oshima, and Tokehiko Bo Owabo, who was handling the sound. However, the concept for what would become Phantasy Star came from Chieko Aoki. In the end, she was only credited as an assistant on the first game, but the whole idea and draft of the story, a tale based in science fiction with hefty influences from the likes of Star Wars that spread across 4 planets, was hers, and even at this early stage it was so in-depth that Aoki had written a great deal of the dialogue. Being that this idea was already so fleshed out, was so different from the RPG norm and offered so many prospects for technical innovation, Aoki's story idea was naturally the one to go for, although the number of planets in what would be the Algol star system, named after both a real-life star and a programming language, was decreased from 4 to 3 due to worries about memory on the Sega Master System. Aoki's eventual nickname of Letter Che also came from her ability to answer just about any question that the development team had about the game or her story immediately. She was that locked into it. What's often noted about the team behind Phantasy Star was that, for the time period, it featured a pretty balanced mix, plenty of men and women, and that's very much reflected in the game even beyond its main protagonist. This wasn't necessarily a purposeful decision on Sega's part, it was largely down to the way that the company worked, with the women who worked on Phantasy Star making their way up through Sega's apprenticeship systems, a lot of them making their bones on arcade games before switching over to console titles. As far as the executives went, the Phantasy Star team had a pretty open brief. They could work on the title with little in the way of interference, with the one main goal being an RPG on a 4MB cartridge that technically could tower over anything that could be done on the Famicom, and could also be something of a flagship for the Master System in Japan. While its 8-bit predecessor, the Sega Mark III, had already been out for a couple of years, Sega would replace this iteration in October of 1987 with the Master System, which was already how the system had been released internationally, improving it by having FM sound capabilities built in. Previously you would have needed to buy an add-on to enjoy FM sound on your Mark III, and naturally Phantasy Star was going to be making full use of that FM sound. It was also, as mentioned, very important for this game not to be a rip-off of something like Dragon Quest. The team studied Enix's games intensely, but doing so wasn't just to become familiar with the still relatively new building blocks of an RPG, it was to ensure that they couldn't be accused of ripping them off either purposefully or accidentally. Before all the technical flashes of brilliance though, came the characters, the majority of whom were the work of Rieko Kodama, including the main woman of the piece, Alice, or Elisa, Landale. With a heavy influence of Star Wars hanging over the story that Aoki had come up with, Alice was in many ways its Princess Leia, although really she's more important to the story even than that. Indeed, the very opening of Phantasy Star starts with something of a disruption. Nero, her brother, someone who looks a lot more like the usual sort of male hero you would expect to find in an RPG, lies dying on the floor at the hands of the evil Kin Lashik's guards, leaving Alice with the task of ensuring that he didn't die in vain in a story of revenge that will soon expand to encompass the fate of the entire Algol star system. The heroism of Alice Landale is not a lot different from any usual hero's quest. The main difference is that she's a heroine, and there hadn't been too many other games before Phantasy Star that had a woman in the main role in such an in-depth game. That said, there is certainly a pathway that leads to Alice Landale, an evolution that runs from the female lead characters in other Sega games, such as Yuji Naka's Girls' Garden and Kodama's own Ninja Princess, Metroid Samus Aran, the heroes that were part of several of Namco's deeper arcade games such as Baraduke and The Return of Ishtar, and Lucia from Sunsoft's adventure platformer The Win of Medulla. So no, Alice didn't exactly come out of nowhere. She felt like a natural logical step when you consider what had occurred in gaming up to that point, not to mention a very natural fit for the team behind the original Phantasy Star. The other character that was entirely Kodama's was Lutz, or Noah as he's named in the Western translation. From all accounts, Lutz as a character came together rather easily, the mysterious Esper who's that little bit older than Alice and accordingly acts as something of a calming presence. As first designed, the gender of Lutz was purposely kept ambiguous. In fact, the original idea was that Lutz's gender could change depending on Alice's actions, although this was dropped and the story eventually just referred to him as male. These Esper characters are one of the constants of the whole Phantasy Star story. Really, if anyone had a claim to be the main characters of the saga, it probably would be them, and it all starts here with Lutz. The other two characters in the main party would not be designed by Kodama. Odin, otherwise known as Tyron, was the work of Naoto Oshima, given to him by Kodama because she didn't feel comfortable creating a big muscular man, and Oshima, working on his first game, created an appropriately muscle-bound male warrior who, much like a lot of other similar game characters in those days, looks somewhat like a blonde Arnold Schwarzenegger. Finally, Meow, the Musk Cat, was made by sub-designer Takako Kawaguchi, who had the alias Choco. Again, the inclusion of Meow was geared towards making the game feel different, to have this strange animal as part of your party, as opposed to the norm of having a regular group of humans that were more defined by their jobs and classes. So in the end you have the female warrior lead, the much more mysterious and slightly older Esper, the big action hero and, well, the cat. It's a pretty marked difference not just from the likes of Dragon Quest, but also other games like Ultima and Wizardry that were also very much on a fantastical bent. Part of this difference also lay in the game's name. While Yuji Naka had dubbed it Phantasy Star with an F after a popular song named Nagisa no Fantasy by Noriko Sakai, Ryoko Kodama opted to spell fantasy with a PH in order to mark it out as different to a more traditional fantasy-based RPG. The name also suggests that the game is going to be fantasy but with a twist, which is pretty accurate. While Phantasy Star does take place in a more sci-fi setting, it still features a lot of the swords, magic and monsters that you would find in a more traditional fantasy-based game, making it something of a hybrid. Still, even if the world of Phantasy Star is so different to anything else that was around, with its multiple planets, alien races and futuristic themes, every RPG needs dungeons. And again, Sega wanted something that was going to stand out. Yuji Naka was largely responsible for the creation of the scrolling 3D dungeons that would end up being the original game's calling card, and certainly the main part of the game that decisively could not be recreated on the Famicom. He'd actually been working for a while on a program for dungeons on the Master System that moved incredibly quickly for the console, something that perhaps could be used in a 3D shooter. Indeed, it was almost too quick at first, according to accounts from developers. In a Retro Gamer article by Nick Thorpe about the game's creation, Naka admitted that the smoothness and quick turns of the dungeon gave him and other people motion sickness. In the end, this 3D dungeon was slowed down considerably, not just to stop people getting sick from looking at it, but also so that the 3D dungeons could be fitted into the 4MB cartridge. Even outside of dungeons, people could get a closer look at the world from the ground when they were talking to people, or simply through accessing the menu, where they'd be greeted with illustrations that still look wonderful to this day. As mentioned in a 2003 interview with Kodama, a lot of these images originally only filled half of the screen and were then vertically mirrored in order to save on memory. Speaking of memory, the 4MB cartridge with a ROM clocking in at 512KB was, as far as anyone knew, as far as the Master System could be pushed at the time. Naturally, this large size would be a big part of the game's marketing, and that would obviously have an effect on the price, along with the inclusion of battery backup for multiple game saves. The game originally sold for 6,000 yen when it was released at the end of 1987, and it was sold for the rather large price of $70 when released in the United States nearly a year later, pretty much more expensive than anything else on the market. Another area where the game turned heads was in the wide range of monsters. There are 27 different types of monster in the game, everything from bog standard slimes and scorpions to zombies, sandworms, robots, leashes and serpents, and in addition to the 27 regular monsters, all of which have different classes, there's appropriately imposing bosses. Also, all of these creatures, largely the work of graphic designer Kazuyuki Chaotic Kaz Shibata, were drawn in plenty of detail and animated to a level far beyond anything that could be seen in something like Dragon Quest. In the 1993 interview for the World of Phantasy Star Sega book, the team revealed that they could have put multiple instances of a monster on the screen if they'd wanted, although they eventually opted to have just one in the battle screen. One of the great puzzles of Phantasy Star for people was just how the team managed to pack so many of these monsters into 512 kilobytes. And again, a lot of this was down to Yuji Naka's programming, compressing each monster's individual sprite in so many different ways in order to eke out as much space as possible. A good example of this was revealed when, in 2018, M2's Sega Ages version of the original Phantasy Star came out for the Nintendo Switch. This version featured a monster guide created by Naoki Hori, but it proved far more challenging than they'd first thought, not just to uncompress the data for all the game's monsters so that they could be used in the guide, but even to find them in the source code. Particularly when it came to one of the game's bosses, the Mad Doctor, Hori could not even find the data for it, no matter what. In the end, M2 simply had to redraw Dr. Mad and his animations from scratch for the monster guide, because it was impossible to figure out exactly what Naka had done for the monster. All anyone knew was that it saved more space on the cartridge. As was often the case with game development during this time, the whole of the Phantasy Star team were working inside the same office, everyone with their own tasks. Even Tokehiko Iwabo, producing the game's music and sound, would have been working in the same space. As with everyone else in the team, Phantasy Star was basically Bo's first experience with an RPG, although he considers the end result to be one of his finest works. It's probably worth stressing how much the team was flying by the seat of their pants, something that they were able to do because their bosses had essentially left them to their own devices to figure it out and make something with minimal interference. It's not just as if Sega weren't notable for RPGs, the gaming press would have probably picked them as the last company they would ever associate with making such a game. Such was their reputation for arcade action. And that's perhaps a big part of why Phantasy Star ended up being so different from the norm. Although the months before Phantasy Star's arrival saw Sega release 2 conversions of computer RPGs in the shape of Black Onyx, which ended up being the last game released for the SG-1000, and the PC-88 game Miracle Warriors, this was a far, far bigger deal than both of those. Everyone on the team had their own major contribution, including people like Miki Morimoto, who was responsible for the statistics and tables for the monsters, weapons, levelling up and other assorted items. She was also the main playtester for the game, charged with constantly seeking out bugs, and for this she earned the nickname of Gamer Miki-chan, also getting a little cameo appearance in the game itself as the girl on the very remote town of Sapir, who absolutely adores Sega and agrees with you that Sega games are the best. While there were other little cameos for staff members hidden away in the game, Mickey's is probably the most notable one, and one of only 2 that made it through the English translation. Others, including Takako Kawaguchi and Chieko Aoki, were unfortunately removed. Kotaro Hayashida also designed the various vehicles that would make it into the game, such as the Ice Digger, the Hovercraft and Land Rover, that would be needed to pass through the trickier terrains of Parma, Matavia and Azores. This focus on multiple vehicles was something he'd already used on his previous title, Alex Kidd in Miracle World. In the end, there wasn't a whole lot of drama surrounding the development of Phantasy Star. The whole team worked together well in their small space, and everything was planned out well enough for the game to be done on time. Not that there wasn't any crunch, of course. As the year rolled on, the jobs of designers, such as Rieko Kodama, finished, and the focus totally went into that final stretch where everything has to be smoothed out and all the bugs have to be eliminated. There were certainly going to be some long days in the office and stories of members of the team such as Miki Morimoto and Chieko Aoki sleeping on makeshift beds in conference rooms, as detailed in the 93 World of Phantasy Star interview. But the game would be ready on time and ready for release on December 20th, 1987 in Japan, coming out just under a year later in November 1988 for the North American and European markets. Famously, in what still must be one of the greatest weeks for Japanese RPGs ever, the original Phantasy Star came out a mere 2 days after the release of the first Final Fantasy on the Famicom, while the story was wholly different in the West. Phantasy Star came out 9 months before the original Dragon Quest was localised and released as Dragon Warrior on the NES, and almost 2 years before the arrival of the original Final Fantasy in the US. Even despite the cartridge's high price, the game was most certainly a success sales-wise, a rare and welcome one for the Master System in Japan, and a flagship title in all territories that was undoubtedly the most advanced game available on an 8-bit machine up to that point. While there were some critical notes aimed at the game's high price, it's largely reviewed very positively, with people being wowed by the graphics, music and epic story, and nowadays Phantasy Star frequently tops lists for the best Master System games of all time. So, it's time to look at the game in a bit more detail. This doesn't necessarily just mean going through every plot point one by one, but also looking at how things tend to play out here in a JRPG that is still, in the grand scheme of things, a pretty early one for the genre. This is, after all, still 1987. There are of course a few different ways to play the original Phantasy Star. You've got the original Western version, you've got fan translations of said Master System original that certainly improve on the original translation. There's the Phantasy Star Generation 1 remake on PS2, which has also been fan translated and features a great deal of added cutscenes and other changes, various other ports that are part of collections on other consoles, and finally there's the 2018 Nintendo Switch Sega Ages port from M2. This is closer to the original again, but with quality of life improvements such as auto mapping and the ability to switch between the PSG and FM versions of the soundtracks on the fly. And as a result, this is probably the version that most would recommend people to play nowadays. However, for the purposes of review, I want an experience that's pretty close to how it would have been back in the day, so I'm opting for the original Master System Western release. Naturally, as this is going to be quite in-depth, there's going to be plenty of spoilers. As previously mentioned, Phantasy Star begins with the death of a hero. We begin in the town of Kamenet on the planet of Parma in what this version of the game calls Space Century 342. Usually dates in the Phantasy Star universe are styled as AW342, standing for After Wars. The planet is ruled with an iron fist by King Lashik, or Lassic as he's called in the original translation, who was for a time a benevolent ruler, but in recent years his reign has turned to terror and martial law has been declared. Nero Landau tried to find out the cause of this change in Lashik, but his efforts were discovered, and to set an example, he was assassinated. And here's where things begin, with the dying Nero telling his younger sister Alice to seek out a legendary warrior named Odin, and Alice declaring that she will ensure her brother didn't die in vain. And so that's all we know at the start, and naturally you can bet that finding this Odin isn't going to be entirely straightforward. Indeed, the game's going to start with a fair bit of grinding, as the majority of Phantasy Star games tend to do, so it makes sense to talk about that first. Grinding in the original kind of makes sense, even if it can be a bit slow going at first. There's even a tiny little patch of forest inside the city walls where you can fight the game's weakest enemies, the swarms, and feel as if Alice is doing the appropriate training needed to become a true warrior. As the scope of the game increases, it's fun to think back to everything starting from a tiny little forest near Kamenet, or at least that's one way to justify the hours spent walking in a circle looking for monsters to kill. Personally, I don't tend to mind the busy work of grinding too much as long as it's something I can kind of zone out on and just do casually, which Phantasy Star kind of allows. Go to the forest, kill a few swarms, occasionally go to the House of Suelo in Kamenet where you get healed for free, gradually venture out a bit further and face slightly tougher enemies as you gain levels and earn enough meseta, or money, for new equipment, rinse and repeat. There'll always be patches of grinding as you go through the game, often more in the service of earning enough cash to buy the best equipment more so than gaining levels, although generally speaking you'll always be doing the best grinding in the open world rather than having to go into dungeons to do it. Hopefully, in time, you'll come across the best grinding spot, a spot in Motavia not far from the town of Uzo, where you fight nothing but highly lucrative sandworms, ideally killing them pretty fast at that stage of the game. Still, there's a long way to go before we get there. For now, another one of the most important things that you learn early on is that you should probably talk to everyone whenever you venture into a town, happily walking uninvited into huts to say hello to whoever's inside. In an early RPG like this one, NPCs tend to be more functional rather than simply there to add colour to a place. Usually they'll give you hints and tips, or important clues, and if you were playing this back in the day it would probably be in your best interest to write them down, because otherwise finding some of the key items you need later on can be quite obtuse. And even with these clues you may well have to struggle with the vagaries and inaccuracies of the original translation. Anyway, a man called Nikis in one of the Kamenite huts will tell you that they've heard of an Odin living in the port town of Sion, not too far away, although far enough that you'll want to level a bit in order to cut through the owlbears in the forest, and he'll also give you your first key item, a Laconian pot. It takes a little while for the whole party to come together, of course. Naturally, Odin's not going to be just sitting around in Sion waiting to join an epic adventure. In fact, you'll have to go to a whole other planet if you want to have any hope of finding him. Once you press a shopkeeper for his secrets and earn a road pass that takes you to Parma's starport, you'll soon find yourself planet hopping between Parma and Motavia, a nice way for the scope of the game to be demonstrated early. The two worlds are very different indeed. Parma is, of course, the most Earth-like world, being that it's largely made up of green with lush forests and fields, and filled with Parmanians, who are basically humans. Motavia, on the other hand, is basically nothing but harsh desert and mountain, although the Parmanians have a pretty large presence here, with several large settlements on the planet, including Paseo, the first town in Motavia that you'll come across. This Parmanian expansion isn't necessarily welcomed by the local residents. Indeed, if you go exploring around a bit, you'll probably come across hostile bands of native Motavians. The majority of Motavians you'll meet are aggressive, and the same goes for the residents of the third planet, Desoris, that we'll come to later on. It appears as though Kin Lashik's terror also extends to be an aggressively expansionist when it comes to the other two planets in the Algol system. Anyway, Paseo is where we find the second member of our party, Meow the Musk Cat, who we trade with a shopkeeper for that Laconian pot we got. Meow's main specialisation is in supportive magic, which he'll learn more of later on, although he's not too bad in a fight thanks to his claws. He also knows where Odin is. Unfortunately, he's been turned to stone, and while Meow has the antidote required to save him, Auschlein, he can't apply it because, well, he's a cat. He lacks the strength and the opposable thumbs. Still, we can go ahead and do that now, and if someone's been petrified, then naturally that means good old Medusa is going to be involved somewhere. This may be a star system millions of light years away from our world, but that doesn't mean you won't be encountering mythical monsters from ancient Greece. The process of going to Medusa's cave back on Parma is a good excuse to start talking about how it is to actually play through the dungeons. Naturally, you'll want to get prepared beforehand, grinding up to ensure you've got the appropriate weaponry and armour, making sure you've got flashers in order to light the way, and of course having lots of healing items. In this original Western translation, the healing items are called cola and burger, because Western people are fat. Okay, perhaps not for that reason. I guess someone thought that would be more understandable than the more common universe names of monomate and dimate. Also, you buy these items from first food shops, an amusing mistranslation that obviously should have read fast food. Now technically the 3D dungeons are Phantasy Star's grand calling card. It's still a wonderful effect to be seen on the 8-bit Master System, but yes, playing through them can be tricky. While this first one is relatively simple, being that it's only a single, fairly small floor, it won't take long before you have to go through caves and buildings filled with multiple floors, pitfalls, booby-trapped treasure chests, and of course, plenty of monsters. And yes, all the dungeons are less featureless, nothing but brick walls and no real landmarks or unique objects to mark the way. This is of course what you would often encounter in other dungeon crawlers or games like Wizardry. In these times you would obviously want to get out the graph paper and start making your own maps, which you can do thanks to finding a compass in this first dungeon alongside Odin, who gets unpetrified thanks to the little pot containing Auschlein that hangs around Meow's neck. Of course, these days you're obviously able to easily access other people's maps of the game's many dungeons, or you can play the aforementioned Switch version of the game that has auto-mapping. Naturally that improves things a lot because, well, if you try to play this game and you don't do those things, and you don't create your own maps, yeah, you are absolutely going to get lost in these mazes very easily before too long. This is also a good chance to get deeper into the art of battling. Generally, Phantasy Star is quite simple in this regard, especially now that we've just got Odin, a classic warrior character with zero magic but who hits like a truck. It's mainly all about attack, attack, attack. You only ever fight one type of monster in a battle, although there can be as many as 8 instances of them, and all their HP gets shown in the top right. One of the main irritants that people find in the original Phantasy Star is that you cannot choose a target. Whether you attack physically or with magic, the target will be selected at random unless you're using something like a gun or an offensive spell that hits everybody. This does mean that a monster with low HP can potentially get another hit in if they're not targeted on a turn, which can be troublesome if you're in tough battles where every hit counts. How often you get into such situations of course depends on how well you're leveled up and how prepared you are, but it doesn't take much for things to get dicey. On the subject of targeting individual enemies, it should probably be mentioned that this wasn't a common thing in RPGs at this early stage, or it wasn't all the way there yet. While Dragon Quest II, for example, did allow you to target different types of monster if you were in a battle with more than one, you couldn't target an individual monster in a group, although that game didn't automatically tell you which monster had the least HP anyway. The original Final Fantasy may well have been the first major JRPG to actually allow you to target an individual monster in a pack, rather than fighting them as one big group. Although it should also be mentioned that the Western-made Black Onyx allowed you to target enemies individually from the beginning. If you do get into serious trouble inside a dungeon, there are a few things that can help you beyond munching on futuristic Big Macs. You can save absolutely anywhere you want in Phantasy Star, and there's actually 5 slots. You may want to take advantage of this in order to have some backup saves and the like, just in case you really end up screwing the pooch and save yourself into a totally unwinnable position. There are other items and spells that can also help. You can use the Escaper item, or Alice's Buy Magic, if you're in a fight that's clearly not going your way and you can't flat out run from, and you can also use the Transit item, or Fly Magic, to teleport to the last church you visited, or all the way back to Alice's home. And yes, this can be used inside dungeons. Phantasy Star 1 is not necessarily a difficult game, certainly not when compared to its immediate sequel. It's more a game of its time, one that generally expects you to do a lot more in the way of preparation for a dungeon, and perhaps has a little bit of a slower pace than you would expect from a later RPG, what with the time you're going to be spending doing things like grinding for money rather than levels, working your way through clues from the townspeople, or having to map out dungeons. All of this was a part of the experience. Now, while the 3D dungeons were most certainly shouted about on Phantasy Star's release, it is perhaps easy to see why the other 3 single-player games in the series never revisited them. The featurelessness of the dungeons was particularly frustrating for Rieko Kodama, as she took more and more of a central role in overseeing the games. It's not as if she didn't want them back, as she did make efforts to see if they were feasible, but if 3D dungeons were to come back in any of the other games, they had to be a lot more varied in textures, and they had to, well, just include more unique features that would allow players to make their way around them easier. Unfortunately, it just wasn't possible to do that while retaining the smooth scrolling and having them be full screen, as they were here on the Master System. It wasn't possible when making Phantasy Star 2 for the Mega Drive, and it wasn't even possible when making Phantasy Star 4, even if the size of 4's ROM was 6 times bigger than that of the original. If it wasn't possible to improve the dungeons drastically on those 16-bit games, then it wasn't worth doing, and it was better to opt for more traditional top-down dungeons, which in many ways speaks to how remarkable an achievement it was to have these 3D dungeons in the original game at all, even if they are somewhat barren. So, what of the general beats in the story, and how you go about getting to them and all of that? The next one is rather amusing. You decide that it might be worth seeing Matavia's governor on Passio, but in order to gain access to him you need to bribe the guard with a gift, specifically a shortcake. Of course, if you use basic logic, you probably think that the best shortcakes in Algol are found in some town or other, probably in a food shop that also sells burgers and colas. And of course you would be completely wrong. The best shortcake seller in the land operates out of the bottom floor of a 4th floor cave that's filled with werebats and other tricky monsters. Again, this is information that you will need to ascertain through talking to everyone. Otherwise, why on earth would you ever think to look in a cave beyond it being one of the areas that's available to you at this time? One thing that does perhaps help with regards to the worlds in Phantasy Star is that at least in the beginning, it's not as if you can just go anywhere, and a lot of areas are somewhat cordoned off by things such as the clouds of poison gas that Lashik has released to isolate certain towns. But still, it's in a bloody cave. The seller even apologises to you for setting up his shop in such a hostile location, and the developers even commented on it back in 1993. According to Kotaro Hayashida, they simply thought that it would be boring if the cake shop was just plunked down in a town, and either Mimi Morimoto or Chieko Aoki suggested putting it inside a dungeon. It may possibly have also been another little developer cameo in the Japanese version that didn't survive the translation, but that is the sort of playfulness you get from these developers. Some people who spent a long time looking for the cake shop may of course use some more colourful language there. The key with discovering where to go next is, of course, to always expect the unexpected, and, once again, talk to everyone. That's how things were done then. You're kind of left to your own devices and expected to follow an instinct to gather as much information as you can. One of the more intriguing plot points comes after you've found that shortcake and had a chat with the governor, who's sympathetic to your cause and sees the danger that Kin Lashik represents. You're invited to have a little rest, but during said sleep you're thrust into a boss battle with a face called a succubus that, bluntly put, you almost certainly can't win at this stage of the game. It is technically possible, but not exactly worth doing. And when he overcomes you, you wake up from the nightmare. This dream is a signifier of something to come, of something far bigger that lurks beyond, something more than a kin that's become evil. This sort of dream sequence, and indeed the concept of the unwinnable fight, is something that Phantasy Star will revisit often, and here it does provide one of the few character points that you will find in the story. This is again one of the things about playing an older RPG such as Phantasy Star. There isn't exactly a whole lot of character development, with it perhaps only being found when a character is introduced. We'll find Noah, the 4th and final character in our party, not long after this, and once again he's introduced as a strong and silent elder sort of character, one who, as an Esper, brings more offensive magic to the party, but generally there's not going to be too much in the way of dialogue between our group once they're in. Again, this sort of thing comes down to memory constraints. We know from interviews that Kodama, Aoki and others had certain ideas, whether it was being able to determine Alice's personality by making choices in the game, and that also affecting the initially ambiguous gender of Noah or Lutz. But these ideas had to be simplified, largely due to time and memory constraints, and such things having to fall by the wayside as the game became ever more streamlined. At this stage, it's perhaps worth talking a little about the game's music. If there is one thing that certainly helps with grinding, or with making a path through dungeons, it's the game's terrific soundtrack. While this may have been Tokuhiko Iwabo's first RPG, it certainly wasn't his first rodeo with the Master System. He'd already composed and arranged music for a great deal of first-party Master System games, including Alex Kidd in Miracle World, and several arcade conversions. The original Phantasy Star is arguably his masterwork, a wide range of very memorable tunes that could easily match up to any other RPG. Still, how is this soundtrack best experienced? Through the Master System's original PSG chip, or with the upgraded FM sound? It's not the easiest decision. Obviously the quality of the tune still shines through regardless, but the cleaner tones of the FM and the rougher edges of the PSG both have their positive points. Personally, because I obviously know this original Western version of the game the best, the PSG soundtrack is what I hear in my mind when I think of Phantasy Star, but it's very much up to debate, and of course, nowadays, if you wish to hear the FM soundtrack while playing a Western version of the game, that's perfectly possible. Either way, this wonderful music is just another one of the many things that make Phantasy Star the classic title that it is. As we get further into the world of Parma and the rest of Algol, the land only ever seems to become more desolate and hostile. We come across towns that are almost totally ruined, areas that have been destroyed by lava that's not being cleared up, or even areas of Matavia that are completely impenetrable due to clouds of poisonous gas. It's at this stage of the game where the group starts to acquire various vehicles and items they need to deal with these problems. A Land Rover to cross over Antline Hills on Motavia, a hovercraft that can deal with the lava and travel over water, a self-explanatory gas shield, and perhaps most importantly, your own spaceship, crafted by a genius scientist called Dr. Levino that Noah tells you about when you first meet him, controlled by a robot that you find and repair in one of the many ghost towns dotted around Parma's outskirts. This spaceship is the only way that you can get to the third planet, Desoris, where you'll also need an ice digger to get through the snow mounds. As mentioned previously, this abundance of vehicles was something that Kotaro Hayashida had made use of in Alex Kidd in Miracle World, where Sega's mascot could happily get through some stages using motorbikes and pedalcopters, but it also fits well into the general sci-fi theme, which when you look back at some of the team's other games, is something that they were pretty fit for undertaking. Just as work was beginning on Phantasy Star, Hayashida was finishing up planning on his previous game, Zillion, the impossible mission-esque platform adventure that tied in with an anime of the same name and prominently featured Sega's light phaser as a weapon. Meanwhile, Rieko Kodama's previous arcade game had been 1986's Quartet, one that she'd fully designed. The sci-fi themes of this particular multiplayer arcade, as well as the involvement of Kodama, have often led people to speculate about any possible relation that Quartet might have to Phantasy Star, if it's potentially something of a forerunner. There's not a whole lot of evidence for this really, but the prominent games that people on the team such as Hayashida and Kodama were working on do lead them quite naturally towards the creation of Phantasy Star. Now that we have the vehicles, the brunt of the rest of Phantasy Star lies in gradually obtaining the best equipment for your party, which of course you will need not just to have any chance of defeating La Chic, but to deal with the monsters as they get stronger. By this stage of the game, grinding becomes a hell of a lot more about earning money than anything to do with levels. The best armour and weapons can be very expensive indeed, so the levels are just going to come naturally when you're trying to earn tens of thousands of Meseta in order to buy things like laser shields or diamond armours. Now that you have a full party, the way you fight can vary a little. Odin, for example, can use both handheld weapons, but also guns that are guaranteed to hit every enemy in a single turn, and are pretty damn useful when you're fighting a lot of them, while having Noah now gives you access to some pretty decent offensive magic that's most certainly a lot better than anything he can do physically, although he can also use his wands to guarantee an escape from battle if a fight gets really hairy. There are other supportive spells centred around protecting the party from attacks or buffing physical offense that can be very handy during boss fights, while some of the stranger spells even allow you to communicate with the monsters you're fighting with, which is somewhat unique, while a lot of the time they may just say something like, "What are you doing?" Occasionally some monsters may say something a bit more useful, which hints that they were once humans who have been possessed and transformed by the Sheik. That said, Phantasy Star doesn't exactly encourage you to use magic willy-nilly. There's no item available to restore MP, and you can only do it through healing in a town, so magic is really best saved for the bosses. Of course, the very best armour and weapons aren't just going to be found in shops. They'll require little quests of their own, whether it's finding Noah's master, Tarzimal, and proving that you're worthy of your task in combat, seeking out a little island to get a mirror shield that will help when you finally take on Medusa and retrieve the strongest weapon in the game, making sure that you don't stupidly give Meow away to the appropriately named cat-hating Dr. Mad, and ultimately finding the most treasured material in all of Algol, Laconia, which is apparently the only thing that can truly stop the Sheik. The search for Laconia in particular is what will finally take us to the third planet, Dezoris, the Ice World. Generally speaking, arriving at Dezoris tends to be where the big quest starts to get serious momentum in Phantasy Star games, because it's usually going to be a while before you get there. While there are a couple of Parmenian settlements on this largely hostile world, it's mainly filled by the Dezorians themselves, very tall, green-skinned, devoted to a faith, and often unintelligible. Much like the Motavians, a lot of them will also be quite aggressive indeed, meaning that unfortunately you'll have to savagely cut them down and wonder who on earth could be responsible for such blind, ugly violence. One other thing that's very important to know about Dezorians is that, well, they don't always tell the truth, something which you'll find out if you talk to everyone. The main city on the planet, Twin Town, is one of the funnier ones in the game. The people on the left will tell you the truth, while the people who live on the right tell you nothing but complete fibs. One of the most infamously cruel examples of this comes in one of Dezoris' caves. You'll be greeted by a native who tells you that you should immediately head left when you come to the first fork. And if you do, well, you get trapped in an endless prison with no way to get out unless you use a transer or magic flute. And God help you if you actually save there. Generally speaking, if a Dezorian tells you to do something, you do the opposite. Alongside Laconia, Dezoris is also where various sacred items are found, and you really get to grips with the true nature of Algol. Is it possible that there's something, an altogether greater menace, that pulls the strings behind the Sheik? The faith of the Dezorians manifests in several items: the llama nut that somehow grows on a single vibrant tree in this wasteland, a torch that's used in ceremony for the eclipse that occurs here every century and is the only thing that can melt the snow from the llama nut tree, and the Aeroprism. It's said that when this is held up as close as it possibly can be to the sky, it will reveal exactly where the Sheik is hiding. Naturally, getting to any of these items isn't going to be easy. At this late stage of the game, the dungeons are larger than ever. They're not always caves anymore, oftentimes they're huge towers with several floors, and they'll either be incredibly complex and chock full of dead ends, pitfalls and worthless treasure, or they may occasionally be somewhat linear. However, to make up for that, they will be filled with the strongest possible enemies, some of which you may have previously faced as bosses. Preparation for these battles is more important than ever because many entire games have been lost to places like this, and it's only going to get tougher. It would be harsh so close to the end to get yourself into a totally unsalvageable situation, but in an older RPG like this one, it's never the best idea to rest on your laurels and think that you can just stroll into a big tower without being prepared. Speaking of big towers, well, once we're done with Dezoris, we're just about at the end game. Naturally, that's going to present the biggest challenge of them all. There are two words that will strike absolute terror into the hearts of anyone who played through this game back in the day. Buyer Malay. Once you get back to Parma and make your way through the prison that lies in its shadow, you find yourself at the foot of easily the largest and toughest dungeon in the game. A hulking 8th-floor behemoth that not only will throw endless strong monsters at you, but requires absolutely full exploration. You need to find the crystal in here in order to penetrate the Sheik's defences. To get through this labyrinth without mapping it out in one way or another is, well, virtually impossible. By this point, of course, it should be worth the challenge. It's not as if the whole game hasn't been preparing you for this moment, but it's a hell of a lot to do even if you're fully prepared for it, especially when there's no way to restore magic points or anything like that. This area is home to one more funny Easter egg. To get the crystal, you must find and speak to Damor, a master soothsayer. You must convince him that you believe in his works, whether they're true or not. Hardly oddest of his questions is, are you searching for Alex Asale? To which you must respond in the affirmative. Now for years, a lot of people wondered, who on earth is Alex Asale? You can find old threads on message boards and the like asking about it, seeing as he's not actually in the game. You may be able to figure this one out by now. Asale is part of Kotaro Hayashida's nickname, and Alex is in reference to Alex Kidd. It's possible that the translation screwed up a little and Damore was supposed to say, do you believe in Alex Kidd? Although I reckon that this kind of works out better, seeing as it makes things that little bit more confusing, and paints this soothsayer out even more as something of a fibber. This is one of only 2 staff cameos in the English version of the game, the other one being Mickey, the Sega fan, all the way back on Sapir. And once you figure it all out, Damore will give you the crystal that you need, and you're finally ready to go to the top of the tower. Once you arrive there, you get one of the game's most legendary sequences. The Aero Prism is held up to the sky and reveals the Sheik's grand palace, the Celestial Castle, accompanied by possibly the game's best composition, Sky City. From there, you feed Meow the llama nut, and he bursts into light before revealing himself as a larger, winged creature who'll be able to take you there. Of course, it's not as if you're totally getting away without another big fight against a gold dragon in the clouds, another memorable moment. Happily, the Celestial Castle isn't anywhere near as complex as Biomalay, and indeed it's largely a straight path. However, you have to do it straight after Biomalay and a tough boss, with no church or hospital to get healed at. Hopefully you've bought enough Big Macs along. Really, you should have sold every single item that served its purpose by now and filled up the whole inventory with burgers and perhaps a couple of transers. Because this is, after all, the big finish. When you finally come across the Sheik, he'll even ask you if you wish to kill an old man. Although, naturally, it doesn't matter what you choose, because he's going to be attacking you anyway. Fittingly enough, he is certainly the toughest enemy you've faced so far. Even with all the preparation in the world, he hits like a truck, and usually hits everybody at once. If you didn't get that crystal, well, he'll basically kill you instantly. It is a tricky slog, but when he falls, it's utterly satisfying. The Sheik's reign of terror has ended, and the death of Nero has been avenged. All that's left to do now is to get back on dry land and return to the governor of Matavia with the good news about the Sheik's demise. Which of course we do after we get ourselves cleaned up a bit following such a tough slog. The whole sequence from Biomalay to the Celestial Castle, including 3 boss fights with the Gold Dragon, the Sheik's Shadow, and finally the Sheik himself, is quite the lengthy challenge indeed, and a very worthy way to finish up this game. We reach the Governor's Palace, where hopefully some sort of welcoming party or celebration will be laid on. But the Governor is not there. Instead, we suddenly get thrust down a pit and into another dungeon. Because no, it's not over yet. Why, after all, did the Sheik suddenly turn evil in the first place? It's not as if he was born that way. He used to be, by all accounts, a benevolent kin. For all that he did, his story is almost one of tragedy, of something that was possibly even beyond his control. And just what did that dream mean? The one where we were pulverised without barely a second thought? Here, under the Governor's Castle, we may find some answers, or we may die for real this time. Much like the Celestial Castle before it, this final dungeon is largely a straight shot with the exception of a cheeky hidden wall right near the end. Usually these hidden walls are used to hide treasure, but not so here. Once you get out of this circle, however, and use the miracle key to unlock the last door, you'll find the real cause behind this whole episode. Dark Force, or Dark Falls as he's styled here, is the pure personification of evil, the demon who plagues Algol every 1,000 years, intent on nothing but destruction. The once kind Sheik found himself possessed and corrupted by Dark Force and those who follow him, turning him overnight into a conduit for the Force's terrors, intent on living forever and ruining his own kingdom. Back in the dream, we only saw his head, and now the whole Dark Force is in front of the party, in the flesh. He is an appropriately horrific creation, just about taking over the entire screen to the point where you can't even see how much health he has, around 500 for the record, which is more than double that of any monster or boss. And he can attack twice in every turn with a bolt of evil that cuts down even the most hardened warriors. Being that this is the last battle, there's only one real strategy. Throw every single thing that you've got at this evil. Boost up Odin and his axe and use the strongest magic, while also being aware that you are likely going to have to heal someone every turn, and there is no heal all spell in Phantasy Star. Personally, even for all the grinding that I'd done up to this point, this battle was not easy. Even when he's weakened to a point where he only attacks once, it is still a long process. But at last, he is conquered. The true crisis for the Algol star system has been defeated. The end of the game sees one further twist. The governor wakes up from his possession, having been taken by Dark Force in one final desperate lunge following his release from the Sheik. He reveals that Alice Landau's father was, in fact, once the king of Algol, and he gives Alice a choice. Does she wish to become the queen of Algol, or continue to live as a private citizen? This decision is entirely up to you, really. Neither choice is regarded as canon, as it's purposefully left ambiguous in future games as to whether Alice took the throne or not, but in either case, she and the rest of the quartet, Odin, Noah, and Meow, will be celebrated as heroes in Algol for eternity. For now though, the credits roll, and they do so in quite spectacular style for the time, with the names of the staff printed on the walls of a 3D dungeon. It is quite the wonderful ending for an 8-bit game, one that certainly fits the bill for an epic story that promised so much, and one that even nowadays still shines to a point where it is almost difficult to believe that it's over 35 years old. Even though so much time has passed, and even if Phantasy Star does feature a lot of the vagaries that you may often find in early RPGs, it's still a thing of beauty that achieved exactly what it set out to do. Sega wanted to make a wholly different entry into this nascent genre that would be the most amazing, most technically proficient, and most epic journey that you could find on an 8-bit console. And they absolutely pulled it off with the original Phantasy Star, setting the course for a journey that, well, most certainly isn't over yet. As a matter of fact, this video isn't wholly over yet. After all, this isn't the only game starring the almighty Alice Landau. That's worth a little look, along with some of the other versions of the original game that are kicking about. It's also worth looking at some of the reflections on the game from the people who made it. During her life, Rieko Kodama took a few opportunities to comment on the game's creation. Primarily, she was proud of her work, even if she admitted to occasionally cringing at some of her early designs. The 3D dungeons, something which required painstaking creation for something that would be relatively simple in this day and age, was a point of pride for the whole team, along with the frame-by-frame detailed animations, and Kodama was happy not just with creating things that had yet to be done in RPGs, such as using large images to display the expression of characters, but also with the creation of Alice Landau. In her words for an interview with Swedish magazine Level, Alice challenged the common stereotype of all main characters in computer games being men. She felt that the creation and success of Phantasy Star helped to overturn some of the ideas that people already had about RPGs, even at this relatively early period for the genre in Japan. Yuji Naka, speaking to Nick Thorpe in 2017 for Retrogamer, said that while Phantasy Star was a project very dear to his heart, he felt it could have been an even bigger franchise if it weren't for other projects gradually taking the original team away from the game, in particular Sonic the Hedgehog, which would see heavy input from Naka, Kodama, and Naoto Oshima. Back in 1993, members of the team such as Miki Morimoto and Kotaro Hayashida talked about the passion that a lot of players still had for Phantasy Star 6 years after the release of the original, to the point where there was a great deal of demand for the game to be ported to the Mega Drive in some way or another from people who'd never had the chance to play the original on the Master System or Mark III. Indeed, the demand grew to a point where the game would get a Mega Drive release of sorts the following year. Phantasy Star for Kokuban, or Phantasy Star Reissue, was released in April of 1994. This version of the game was apparently only available as part of a competition, with reports varying as to how many were made, somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000, it seems. The ROM board itself was exactly the same as the Master System game, only wired differently so that it could fit inside a Mega Drive cartridge shell and be played without requiring a converter. It's the only game to ever be released in this fashion for the Mega Drive, although unfortunately this version only featured the option of PSG sound. Other more straightforward reissues started happening from 1998, when it was released as part of the Japan-only Sega Ages Phantasy Star collection on the Sega Saturn, with other appearances over the years occurring on the Game Boy Advance, the PlayStation 2, the PS3, Xbox 360, and the Wii's Virtual Console, all the way up to the aforementioned M2 Sega Ages version on the Nintendo Switch from 2018. Other more cut-down ports of the game were also released on Japanese mobile phones through Sonic Team's Sonic Cafe portal from 2003 to 2006. There's a standard edition of the game, as well as a Phantasy Star Deluxe edition, which is mostly very faithful to the original despite having to remove certain items and be stingier when it comes to animation, and is also the first of the Phantasy Star remakes to feature an incredibly useful auto-mapping tool. Still, when it comes to ports and remakes with the most changes to the original, we obviously need to talk a fair bit about Phantasy Star Generation 1 for the PlayStation 2, a Japanese-only release from 2003 that was the first game in the Sega Ages 2500 line, offering remakes of classic Sega games at budget prices. Along with various trinkets and a book for cards that you were supposed to collect with the other Sega Ages releases, this features a full-blown remake of the original Phantasy Star, which happily has been fan-translated so that everyone outside of Japan can have a proper look at it. The Sega Ages remakes do tend to be a bit, well, variable in quality to say the least, although it's worth saying off the bat that Phantasy Star Generation 1 is definitely one of the most interesting ones, especially for those who are already fans of the series. Naturally, the graphics have got a big old boost, wholly different and much more detailed, as you would probably expect from a PS2 game, with more variation in the sprites and settings than there was in the original. The same also applies to the 3D dungeons. The old brick walls are gone, replaced by a wide range of textures. Now, does this mean that these graphics are better than the original? Not necessarily. They're totally fine as far as 2D art goes, but perhaps not as memorable as what you would find in the original. Still, this is a budget PlayStation 2 game, and as far as that sort of thing goes, this is fine, and still quite faithful to the original's aesthetics, if not a little more generic. What is certainly better though, is that there's a lot more cutscenes and a lot more dialogue between the characters, something that was unfortunately lacking somewhat in the original due to technical limitations. The cutscenes are largely still images, just as they are in the original, and the artwork for the various characters here is very good. That and the characters can also talk to each other out in the world, just as they could in the fourth Phantasy Star, which can be useful if you're in need of a hint. You may also find little Easter eggs hidden here and there if you're familiar with the games, such as the governor in Passio clearly being an ancestor of the guy who's won in the place 1,000 years later. NPCs themselves tend to have a lot more to say than they did in the original, with a lot of them having more than one line. You had to speak to some people more than once in the original, but here even the most innocuous folk walking around town are likely to have multiple lines of dialogue, and they're also named. The music has also been rearranged, with plenty more instruments and the like. I would alas say that this rearrangement does fall down a fair bit. It's not got the same immediacy of the original soundtrack, and the audio quality is kind of middling. Even if there are a lot more cutscenes, the story and general core of the game has not been messed with. There's no major changes to the planets or the various story beats, and the layout of the dungeons hasn't changed either. If you'd managed to keep hand-drawn maps of them from all the way back in 1987, they'd still be thoroughly useful here. What has changed a hell of a lot though is the gameplay, with many aspects of the game being modernised somewhat and at the very least brought in line with what you would find in Phantasy Star 4. And yes, these changes are generally for the better. Yes, you can now individually target enemies in battle, which is obviously quite useful. The process for using items and upgrading characters is much smoother. It's easy to switch between characters who now all have their own inventory. You get the option to automatically equip new weapons and armour as soon as you buy them and sell the old ones, and you get to see what stats increase with new equipment and when you level up. All of that's good. Elemental attacks are now a big part of the game when they really weren't in the original. You can buy various crystals in Camonite that add an elemental effect to your strikes, and can also be used for special collaboration attacks that are slightly similar to the combo attacks you would find in Phantasy Star 4, although the crystals do tend to break after a while. There isn't a permanent auto map, although there is a new item that allows you to access one in a dungeon for 100 steps. And also you can no longer save anywhere, with that only being limited to towns. All of these changes were probably necessary when it comes to modernising the game, and they do admittedly make for smoother gameplay, especially if you're not that used to the vagaries and occasional brutality of the old school RPG. Speaking of brutality, generally speaking, Generation 1 is a fair bit easier than the original game. The hours of grinding have largely been ripped out. You may have to do the odd bits here and there, but characters level up a lot faster, and you also earn Meseta way quicker, making it easier to save up for the best equipment. I haven't played through the whole thing, but I wanted to do a decent chunk, and by the time I reached Lutz in the Maharu cave, my party was already at around level 20, a level I most certainly wasn't at the same point in the original, and I hadn't done too much in the way of extra grinding either. The statistics, amount of damage you do, and what you take, is generally increased accordingly to be more in line with a modern RPG circa 2003. The numbers are much lower in the original Phantasy Star, where the level cap itself was only 30, and the most health you could ever have was 218. So with all this in mind, is it worth having a look at Generation 1? Generally, I would say yes, although I would say it's certainly going to be more enjoyable if you're already familiar with the original. I wouldn't ever tell someone new to the series to go and play this one first, instead of something like the Master System game or the Nintendo Switch version. The look and music in this can be kind of generic after all, and you can certainly appreciate what this remake is trying to do a hell of a lot more if you know what the original is all about. If you do, then it's definitely an intriguing curiosity, especially for all the changes that it makes and how much dialogue it adds to the story. And when we eventually cover Phantasy Star 2, we'll be seeing another remake from the Sega Ages series that goes for some even more radical changes. But of course, that's a subject for another video. There is one other game to cover that prominently features Alice Landale as a playable character, and this time it's not a remake of Phantasy Star 1. It's a rather obscure original title for the Game Gear that only came out in Japan, although again thankfully there is a fan translation. Phantasy Star Gaiden was released in 1992, and it was not made by anyone from the original Phantasy Star team. Instead, this game's development was outsourced to a studio named Japan System Supply. This is actually the second of two Phantasy Star games that were exclusive to the Game Gear, but the story here means it makes far more sense to cover this game first, while leaving the other one, Phantasy Star Adventure, to be dealt with when we get to Phantasy Star 2. The story in this one takes place hundreds of years after the events of the original, on a planet called Copto that's 1 light year away from the Algol star system. The tales of Alice Landale are known and celebrated over there, to the point where there is a colony named Aliceland. The tale focuses on 2 youngsters from there named Mina and Alec. It all begins with Alec's father being kidnapped by bandits, and naturally it progresses from there to an adventure that's going to involve saving the planet from an evil force named Cabalon who was sealed away 400 years ago and is attempting to break out. Stakes are nothing if not high in Phantasy Star games, even handheld ones like this. So, right from the off, I should say that Phantasy Star Gaiden is quite flawed. A lot of the ingredients are here to make for a decent and somewhat light handheld RPG. It's not as epic in scope as a mainline Phantasy Star game, but then it doesn't need to be. Graphics and music are all okay for the Game Gear, and you're pretty much allowed to have your characters specialise in whatever you feel comfortable with. Unlike most Phantasy Star games, any one of the playable characters can equip any weapon or armour, and the only requirement is that they're at a high enough level to use them. The same is even true of spells. You don't learn spells as you level up in this game, and instead you buy them from a shop. You can also sell older ones that you don't use anymore, making the magic in this game something of a forerunner to Final Fantasy VII's materia. The one huge problem in Phantasy Star Gaiden is pretty easy to identify: random encounter rate. Holy hell, you can barely go 2 steps without getting into a fight at times. While this isn't exactly a long game and something like this would be needed to actually make the game last more than a couple of hours, the amount of encounters is just quite ludicrous. In fact, I'm not sure if I have ever played an RPG that has a higher encounter rate than Phantasy Star Gaiden. Needless to say, this can become kind of annoying, even if battles tend to go by pretty fast in this game. There is perhaps one thing that justifies the high encounter rate. The game does require a lot of grinding. Grinding in this game is somewhat annoying. There's not a whole lot of space between either effortlessly ripping enemies apart without taking any damage, or being completely unable to lay a finger on monsters, to the point where areas almost seem to have brick walls around them and you just have to take a bit of time moving around in circles and levelling up before progressing. It does get rather wearying, to be honest. Once again, at least the battles move along very quickly, and if you do get in a sticky situation, you're almost always able to run away immediately. But the amount of time you're just going to be randomly moving about on XP and Meseta hunts does mean that the game's going to become a little mind-numbing, even when compared to the grinding that had to be done in the original Phantasy Star. Does the story itself make all of this worthwhile? Again, it's a pretty light affair, but it's certainly one of intrigue for those who want to dive further into the series' universe. Nowadays, there's a more accurate fan translation of the game available than there was previously, and as you progress through the game, Mina and Alec will be joined by other characters: a dwarf, a robot, and finally, yes, Alice Landau herself. With Mina and Alec long confused by a prophecy which tells of 2 heroes who go on to save the planet, and one of them being a descendant of Alice, the big twist moment in the game comes when you discover Alice in a cave, where she's been cryogenically sleeping for over 400 years after sealing Cablon away. More than that, it turns out that Mina is actually a clone of Alice that she created years previously. And so, with the legend herself in your party, you defeat Cablon once and for all, save Copto, and Alice returns home to prepare once again for the other evils that threaten the Algol star system. While Phantasy Star Gaiden remains quite an obscure game and the events of this title aren't really mentioned anywhere else, this little portion of the canon does at least give us a bit more time with Alice. It's just a shame that the game itself can be rather irritating when it comes to trying to get through it. It's not an essential title by any stretch, but it may be of interest to fans seeing as how it is pretty easy to access nowadays. Finally, there's a couple of other things worth mentioning that aren't video games at all. In 1989, the original Phantasy Star was adapted into a choose-your-own-adventure book released by publishers Futabasha called Phantasy Star Arisa no Boken, or Elisa's Adventure. Largely, this book is faithful to the plot from the original, features plenty of nice illustrations, and Futabasha would publish similar gamebook adaptations of Phantasy Star 2 and 3. Something else that's also curious is the Phantasy Star Outside Saga. This was a series of comics that were a part of the Sega Players Enjoy Club newsletter that Sega of Japan offered to fans, and there were 4 chapters of this comic. They were written by Judy Totoya, whose real name is Yasushi Yamaguchi, probably most famous as the original designer for Miles Tales Prower, and they act as a more immediate sequel to the events of the original game, detailing the adventures of Elisa and Lutz as they travel through space. If the events of this comic are to be treated as canon, then Elisa refused to become queen at the end of the game, opting instead to travel the galaxy with Lutz, exploring strange new worlds and all of that, and eventually coming into contact with people who still follow the Sheik. A couple of strips from the comic can be found in the Japanese-only World of Phantasy Star book, which is just one of several books that feature plenty of art and information about the original Phantasy Star and the series as a whole, with others including the Phantasy Star Collection and the Phantasy Star Official Production Compendium. Needless to say, they're very useful resources indeed. And with that, we've about covered everything for the original Phantasy Star. But of course, this is just the beginning. There will also be videos covering the other 3 mainline Phantasy Star games, and they are after all quite significant, even the third one. With the sad passing of Rieko Kodama, the First Lady of RPGs, in 2022, it's more important than ever for a colossal work like this to be celebrated. It shocked everybody when it first arrived, wowing people with its detail and technical prowess, and the series as a whole makes for one of the great sagas in the genre, a tale on an interplanetary scale, told over thousands of years. And so, as Alice Landale goes off to take eternal guard alongside her companions, we'll be jumping 1,000 years into the future, for the events of Phantasy Star 2, the first console 16-bit RPG. That will most definitely come soon, but until then, bye for now.